There's a little bit of a delay, so I'm gonna wait a second and then I think there's a delay. Hey, greetings and salutations to the Rev 310 tribe, wherever you may be. If you can hear me and see me, give me a thumbs up. Find my. And the questions have already started coming in. Okay, I see Sarah. Sarah is one of my moderators. She helps out with all that. All right, we got the audio, video. Well, hey guys, I have a special treat today. We have Pastor Ken Ortize from Calvary Spokane, and I just want to let you guys know a little bit about him. He's been in the ministry for over 50 years. Him and his wife both have been dedicated in that, serving in I guess beginning in Northern California, and then from street witnessing to Bible schools, overseas missions to local church ministry. Then he answered the call in 1983 to pastor the Calvary Church there in Spokane, Washington. He's been there ever since. You've also done a lot of mission work to India and Russia. Is that correct?
Yeah, great deal.
Yeah.
Actually, we're deeply invested for a long time.
Well, that is amazing. I took Russian in college. I took 3 years of Russian. I don't remember any of it now, but at the time I thought it was going to be useful. But you can find more at Ken's website, Ken Ortize with an E, Ortiz with an E.com. And I'll put that, I think it's in the show notes already. But Pastor Ken, it is good to have you on here.
Well, thank you. It's been a long time coming.
Yeah, yeah. I was just about to tell you before we started, I came across your ministry through a Jason A video. I don't know if you remember those Jason A videos.
Yeah.
He just does those montages of stuff, and I was like, who is this guy? Man, this guy's amazing. And I must have binge watched, people binge watching Netflix. Like I binge watched all your What's the World Coming To series. Like I don't know how many years in a row that you did it, but man,
Yeah.
loved it. That was such a blessing to me. And I've got them all saved on my YouTube to go back through and listen to from time. And it's still relevant. I mean, goodness
Yeah.
gracious, it's still relevant today. The stuff you've talked about, back in 2019 and earlier. So it's held up very well. Let me put it that way with the things that you mentioned. Let's see here. All right. Well, today we're going to be talking about the new old ways, and it's kind of a blend with a bunch of different subjects, but they're all related to each other. We're talking about postmodernism, the deconstruction of Western civilization, and all the forms and facets that's come through, whether it's cultural Marxism, occultism, Eastern mysticism. I mean, and we're going to start talking about things, and things are going to start blending together because, as much as the world wants to silo things, like, that separation of church and state, the truth is that a lot of the philosophies and things that are coming out of the Enlightenment era, the Age of Reason, all of that time forward. I mean, I guess you could go all the way back to Plato and the Greeks and stuff, but just in modern history, a lot of the stuff that came out of the Age of Reason, particularly after the French Revolution and the French Enlightenment and those geniuses over there, put forth a lot of ideas that I think have poisoned the waters in a lot of ways, and it's impacted society. And I think right now we're to the stage where we're starting to see all the fruits of that uh, blossoming in in remarkable ways, to the point that you have a Supreme Court judge or a Supreme Court justice, a nominee who doesn't even know what a woman is. I think, to me, that was kind of we've reached that point of idiocracy. I don't know if you ever saw a movie, but we're there. So, thoughts?
Yeah. Yeah.
You got any thoughts on the opening salvo there?
Well, I just simply say I think that it's really a confusing time for most Christians because suddenly the overwhelming narrative of our culture is something that's relatively new to most people, and it's like you're talking about, it's the old narrative coming back in a new packaging. So it's just simply like the toothpaste you used to buy that was new and improved. It really just had a different wrapper, but it was the same goop coming out of the tube. And that's what we have culturally now, is we just have an injection of a whole new set of basically quadrants that people are trying to orient and organize their life around and navigate their life around. And yet these things are really just old stuff that's just been repackaged. And just, it's just kind of amazing to me. I think you can look at just about every sector of our society, and you find that there is this narrative that's flowing out, even within the church. We've known this, and it's been happening even when we get talking about the NAR and the World Faith movement from years ago. It was really just repackaging a lot of occultic concepts and principles, put them under, try to give them an intellectual kind of packaging, calling it the new intellectualism or positive mental attitude and things of that nature. But it really, really had the same foundational concepts that had really animated the occult from the earliest times. And so I think as
Yeah.
Christians, many people don't know how to reconcile that with what they see in Scripture. And they're told that the Scriptures are irrelevant and they're ancient and they're not reliable. And so I've seen many Christians begin to modify their faith. I think in fact, I think it's a quite scary dynamic we're seeing happening within the church, where this is intentionally being inserted into the belief system of many denominations and even conservative denominations, where basically we come up with these mantras that says things like, well, the most important commandment of Jesus was to love your neighbor. And I sit back and go, no, the most important commandment of Jesus was you must be born again. If you don't get that part right, you can love people till you die, and then you'll find out that you're going to live in an eternity without that love.
Yeah, that is very true, very true. Oh my gosh, I went to a church in Kansas, man. They literally, the guy preached on love for a year straight. A year straight. Every Sunday was some facet of love. I'm like, and then on
Yeah.
Wednesday nights they had like instead of having a Bible class, and I only went to it a couple times because like I'm not going to drive all the way here to go to this thing. We sat there and learned about personality types. And like, are you an interest? They have all like the codes for the
Yeah.
person. I'm like, what why are we doing this on, like, why am I driving all the way here on a Wednesday night to do some kind of psychology project for you? Like
Well,
I just
yeah, but that's part of the whole dynamic, is, or the narrative, is the fact that you find the answers inside of yourself. Before I was saved, I was into Eastern mysticism in a big way, and I was doing that. I was spending hours meditating, doing all these yogas and all this stuff, trying to find the God essence within myself. And the deeper I went, the darker it got, and the more despairing it got. And I realized that the answer wasn't within me. The answer was outside of me. It was the Holy Spirit speaking truth. And only as I opened to what God was saying from the outside did I really have an answer for what was missing on the inside. But I see it even with family members posting on Instagram and different things, where they do a lot of navel gazing and talking about, coming to peace and loving themselves. And I had one one niece who went out and bought this expensive bouquet, and was telling everybody about how that she bought this as a love gift to herself. I mean, but I understand there's a deep inner turmoil going on there of rejection, unrequited love, and that kind of dynamic. But the reality is, it's an empty bucket at the end of the day. And until people recognize that, they'll be ever searching and never coming to the knowledge of the truth.
Yeah, very true. And do you remember when all the Black Lives Matter all that, the George Floyd riots and all that started?
Yeah.
I'd seen so many people post, white people posting, white Christians posting about, all this kind of self-reflection, how we're kind of collectively guilty and all that kind of stuff. And I simply posted, because a lot of those same church people go, they're on my we're all in the same feeds together. I said, I was in the military for 20 something years. I don't have that problem. I said, when we went to basic training, we were all pieces of, what, brown smelly stuff. And I
Yeah.
said, that's how they treated us. It didn't matter if we were black, white, Asian, whatever. We were all, I mean, literally, you were scum of the earth. And when we graduated, we graduated to maggots. So they said, congratulations, you're no longer turds, you're now maggots. So uh, we just, we just didn't have that same I don't know, complex that I guess a lot of people have. So,
Well, it's kind of like
but
the whole concept of the significant others, that they say in psychology that if you focus on somebody for a long enough time, you'll begin to mimic and adapt their behaviors. Well, we certainly see that in our own experience with our parents. As much as we went through the teen years and said, I'm going to be nothing like our parents, one day you wake up and realize you have become your parents. You are their replacement, and you have all of their issues and all their struggles that they had. But I think what's part of it is that when you begin to focus on something like racism, it actually doesn't free you from racism. It actually creates a racial dynamic like we see in our culture now, where suddenly everything is predicated on some kind of identity of one type or another. And that's because that's all we focus on. And
yeah,
ultimately, I think that it's all when we come to the point where we finally realize that I identify as a follower of Jesus Christ, that's my identity. And that transcends all those others' identity. But until we do that, we're going to fall into the same patterns. And it's really at its root, I think, spiritually and emotionally, I think its root is this trying to find the answer within myself. And striving to be anti-racist will make me into a racist. And that's what and if I strive to be a follower of Christ, then I will become increasingly Christ-like. And I think that's the real challenge that people have, because they have all these siren voices around them. They're saying, look at me, look at me, look at me. And people are just looking all over the place, basically social media in particular. And the result is we spend huge amounts of time. The average adult looks at his cell phone 90 times a day. Or as one gentleman put it, he says, I want to look at it once a day and I never take my eyes off it after that. And so, but I think that we don't understand the things that are shaping our thinking, and that in turn shapes our behavior and our choices and our actions. And I guess, here, this is one of my themes, if there is one today, is that as Christians, we have to be people who are in the Word of God more than we're not, because whatever becomes the primary source of our input is the things that can control ultimately our decision making and the narrative that rules over our life. So it's not just resisting that narrative, it's being able to have a biblical narrative that overrides and sees right through all the other false narratives that are out there. And there are plenty.
absolutely. Let me put this up on the screen here. So I've got the definition, and there. I mean, you can go online and look a definition up of postmodernism, but I mean, it's all over the board. I simply took probably the most the simplest and the kind of the most direct quote I could find, or definition of it if I could find. It is a philosophical movement characterized by skepticism toward grand narratives, including religious and moral absolutes, leading to the rejection of objective truth and traditional structures. And I was focused on the last couple of weeks. I was focused on preterism. I've got a little debate coming up on the 4th of September with a guy. He's a partial preterist, and to be honest, I hadn't really thought a lot about preterism over the years, because I view it like Darwinism. I just it just doesn't hold water to me in any form or fashion. But nevertheless, it's there. But I started to notice some correlations between postmodernism and preterism, and I've kind of list them out here. Postmodernism is the marriage of both the carnal and the spiritual, as they are inextricably linked together. Carnality, the flesh, materialism, whatever you want to call it. When you have Marxism creeps into Western civilization under the guise of liberalism, environmentalism, cultural Marxism, socialism, but ultimately ends up crushing individual liberty and capitalism. And what you end up with is a form of communism, which is the end state. When you talk about the spiritual perspective, skepticism, which came out of the age of reason and rationalism and humanism and naturalism and all the other isms there that were kind of developing and being codified in the 1800s, rides in to these seminaries under the guise of liberalism, and then later higher criticism. And then that is kind of blended in with what's already there, that's been around since Augustine, like amillennialism, and then later on postmillennialism. But ultimately, you end up with you keep developing this level of skepticism, and that skepticism leads to preterism, whether it's partial preterism or full preterism. But it's that same it's that same narrative there of skepticism that you see here, that you see in postmodernism, that asks that question: Can I really trust? Did God really put all these animals on an ark? Did He really flood the world, or was it like a local flood? And they begin to minimalize. And I'm not saying preterists do this. I'm just saying that the skepticism that's inherent within that side of Christianity, liberal Christianity, embraces the skepticism. Well, they try to take the Bible and take it from being a supernatural book, which it is, and trying to just relegate it down to like this book of morals and some history. Some of the history is validated, some's not, and they kind of dumb it down and diminish it to the point where it's just a book like the Quran or the Hindu Vedas or anything else. So that's 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 the correlation I just kind of took, and I'm only sensitive to that right now because I just got done doing all this studying and listening to all
Yeah.
this sermons and debates and stuff on preterism. So, am I on track, or is that
No,
my
I
far
think you
close?
are, because I think the real issue, especially if you go back to Augustine and all the interpretive grid that he used, you had by the fourth or fifth century in the church, you had a lot of Christians who were saying, "Wait a minute, we thought Jesus was going to come, you know, right away, and he hasn't come. So how do we explain the Bible?" And that's when they developed the allegorical method of interpretation. And the idea of the preterist is kind of like trying to go back and find a historical foundation for biblical prophecy, and yet at the same time leaving it limited within the history that we know and what we understand. And I think that that's what I find is one of the things that's interesting, because ultimately, if the book of Revelation is something that's already been fulfilled, why even bother reading it? And yet it tells me that if I don't read it, I'm going to miss out. So, I mean, what it did is it takes all the futuristic dynamics out of it, and it takes the literalness out of the interpretation. So suddenly I'm not reading the book of Revelation or reading Daniel as something that was literally foretelling events that are going to take place. And I don't look for a literal fulfillment. I just start trying to find it in a historical past. And
Yeah,
those kind of, one of the things you have to understand, because one of my majors in college was history. And you realize that historians view events through a lens. Not They don't see everything. They choose a path, a lens through which they're going to look at something and interpret it within that context. And so you realize that this is part of the fallibility of human understanding and interpretation. When Moses says to Israel, the secret things of the Lord our God will never know, but those things which are revealed are for us and our children forever. Well, the bottom line is that he's telling us that we don't have complete understanding. We have limited understanding. And yet we also understand that when the Holy Spirit comes and lives inside of me, there's an expanded capacity for perception and understanding. The best way I could say it to my wife is, I was sharing with her the other night. I said, it's kind of freaky because I'm looking at passages that I've understood for years, and I know what the interpretive. I can look at the commentaries and see how they should be understood, and yet I'm seeing a dynamic or a dimension that is broader and deeper and further. So that when I'm looking at events that are taking place around me right now today, and this is part of what we're all about, right? We realize these things dovetail exactly what the God said. And that's what I tell people all the time. I said, um, if I was, 50 years ago, I would have looked at some of the things that the Bible says will be characteristic for the end times. And I would say, I believe it's true. I just don't know how it can happen. But we're in an era now where the technology has caught up with biblical prophecy, and the Bible foretells things that were unseeable and somewhat unthinkable just 50 years ago. And so we're living in this period of time right now, historically, where the dramatic change, as I said before, the difference between 1900 and 1950, with the age in which my parents matured in, was so dramatic that the world they lived in at the end of their lives was something that bore no resemblance at all to the world that they had been born into. And those of us who are alive, they have a similar experience. What is taking place in 2024 is light years beyond what existed in 1950 when I was born. And I sometimes forget that, and I realize things are so very, very different. In fact, I was at a album release in Nashville just last week, and they were playing in the background the song "How Great Thou Art," and And I started singing along with it. And my 13-year-old granddaughter asked me, or 16-year-old granddaughter asked me, Grandpa, how do you know that song?
It just came out.
That song's older than I am. But it's just that idea that we lose sight of the fact that we are living in a very unique period in which I tell people, if these aren't the last times, I have no idea what to look for, because we're seeing such clear applications. So when you talk about one world government, one world economy, one world religion, something that was feasible but unidentifiable just 50 years ago is something that's not only feasible, it's we're so deep into that process. And most people are totally unaware of how deep we are into that process. But that's the kind of things that you and I and others are trying to make people aware of. Open your eyes and realize you are living in this really critical time in human history.
Absolutely. Yeah. Um,
And I think the
I
predators
was just,
ruin that.
yeah. I found myself getting angry listening to like and just listening to teachings on it. I don't know how many sermons and Sunday school, anything that was video that was on the subject. And these guys are just doing all these mental cheetah flips trying to fit
Yeah.
revelations into like past events. I'm like, I just found myself angry and bitter. Like that's now it explains why those guys are always so angry and bitter. I just it's just like, good gosh. If I listen to this all the time, yeah, I'd be angry too. There's no hope. There's just, one day you die and that's it.
Well, I think
But
that's part of the challenge, because we don't want to be anti-intellectual. But at
yeah,
some point, you have to realize that our intellect is a very limited capacity, and there has to be spiritual revelation. And when you try to, what the predators, I feel, do is try to squeeze everything into an intellectual and explainable dynamic. It's the same thing I see with, really in Reformed theology. I find it really appeals to people who like to be able to answer all the questions, but there's no mystery left in that. And
yeah,
so it becomes like it turns the faith into this thing of, here are the rules and I need to keep them. And whenever you start challenging him about him, saying, well, are you believing that God isn't big enough to do that? You sit back and go, what? Not at all. But what you've done is you defined theology to a gnat's eyebrow. And so there's no mystery left in the fact that there are just some things I don't understand.
yeah. It seems like a lot of them swallow the camel and strain at the gnat.
Yeah.
At the just like I don't get it. Like you can accept all of the first coming prophecies as literally fulfilled, but then all of the second coming ones are done naturally or spiritualized.
Yeah.
There's zero consistency in how they translate that. But here's a if I can quote Paul here. Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where's the disputer of this age? Has not God made the foolish wisdom of this world, or of this world? For since the wisdom of God, the world through wisdom did not know God, and it pleased God through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. For Jews request a sign, Greeks seek after wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified. To the Jews, a stumbling block, and to the Greeks, foolishness, but to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. I God has done a lot of things in history that if we were to, I'm thinking military way. If I was trying to plan this thing out, I would not have done it that way.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
would not have parted the Red Sea, or there's so many different things we could think about. But God does these things in defying. I mean, He creates natural law. He creates the laws of physics. Like He's not bound by any of these things, so He's able to manipulate them to get His point across, to get the message across. And then there was some kind of correlation that it could possibly have later on down the road. With Abraham taking Isaac up on the mount to sacrifice him, and as he's about to, the angel stops him, and then the Lord will provide a sacrifice, and there's a ram stuck in the thicket. So we know at the time it may not have made any sense to Abraham. Like, wait, I waited 90 something years to have this kid, or now he's probably like 110 by the time Isaac was of that age, and now you want me to kill him? I know you can raise him again, but like I'm just not. He's trying to probably think through the the logic of this. But then we look and see how that plays out 2,000 years later with the coming of Christ, and then it's beautiful. It just
Yeah.
shows that this has been on the mind of God for a very long time, from before the foundation of the world. But Um,
Well, that's
here's a good.
the whole concept that
Good.
just live by faith. It realized that those characters didn't have a Bible in front of them to tell them what was going to happen. So they were having to just simply trust that they were following God. And I think that, for in many ways, it's always the proof is in the pudding. What is the consequence? Because I think, as John Stonestreet often says, is that ideas have consequences. And oftentimes ideas have victims, the consequence of bad decisions. And I think that, again, when we come down to really looking at what is the thing that purifies me, well, John says in 1 John 3:1, he says that this faith in the coming of Christ is the thing that purifies me. The fact that I'm living in the light of his coming, that brings a purity in my life. In other words, it really centralizes the focus of my life. And I feel like Satan is always trying to rob the church of that hope and that expectation, and to replace it. I think, even like when I mentioned before, something like the word faith movement, where they really tell you the object of your faith is to be able to get all the stuff you've always wanted to have. And what they've done is suddenly replaced getting stuff with getting to heaven. And they've basically exerted out of the text anything about the suffering, the hardship, the sacrifice, the self-denial, the laying down of your life, because it's all about getting what I want to get. And I guess I'm at that point where I'm seeing it's really up close and personal, where I've known people who have had everything. I mean, literally anything they wanted, they had. They were very Solomonic in that regard, and they came to the end of their life, and they, when you ask how much they leave behind, the answer is all of it. And naked you come into the world, naked you leave the world. And so there's a futility in the sense when we get into this idea of we're trying to reduce the Christian faith down to a formula, then we're not doing anything different than the other Christians are doing. The rest of the world is doing. I mean, and this idea that I walk by faith doesn't mean that I have no concepts or no boundaries or no guardrails in my life, but I realize that my expectation is that God is going to surprise me, and not that I can say, well, God always works in this way. I don't know if
Yeah.
you ever saw the movie with G. Wilder and Frisco Kid, where he plays as a rabbi and he's saying to the Indians, "God never, 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 never causes rain," and then all of a sudden rain breaks out, and he says, "But then sometimes he completely changes his mind." I always identify with that. The people who are trying to say, "God, this is who God is. He will not." I mean, other than the fact that God's essential nature, but beyond his nature, God can do anything, which is part of his essential nature.
Speaking of God's nature, you think about eternity, what we'll do after the kingdom age. I know the Bible doesn't go into any of those details, but one of the things that Lee Brainerd, a friend of ours, mentioned, that and it just resonated with me in a unique way, and I thought, um, was that we will never find the end of God, even after a trillion years. Like, we will never quit being surprised at something that God can do or will
No,
do, or um and that is a comforting thought to me, because if we were like the pagans, if we were like the Muslims or the Vikings, Vikings go to Valhalla and drink in a big beer hall and talk about their fights and wars, and the Muslims get their 72 virgins and all the different, whether you're talking about reaching nirvana or going through reincarnation over and over and over and all this other stuff. I just think that, man, that would get so old after just like the first 10 years, or, or however long. It would just get like really old. But to think that we have that God has chosen to leave this thing out, it's still a mystery that we know we'll always be with him. We know his character, that he is, all of his attributes are perfect. His love is perfect, his justice, his mercy, all of those things. He's unfailing in his promises. And that if he will keep his promises to the Jewish people, despite the fact of all the problems that they caused, all the issues that they had, the fact that they, up until the point of crucifying their own Messiah, and even the 2,000 years now they've been in diaspora, they were in diaspora now as a nation, where they're still in unbelief, to a large part, but that God will still finish and bring that remnant to him at the end through the 70th week of Daniel. That God never quit on them. God never changed. He's still there. and as individuals come to faith, Amir Sarfati, or all the different people that come to faith over the years, Messianic Jews, he is still faithful, and it's like once they see that through the person of Jesus Christ, um, it's just boom. It's just like this. Why didn't we know this sooner? Kind of like
Yeah.
for the
Yeah.
rest of the Gentiles of us that this were fortunate enough to have been exposed to the gospel.
Well, you
I
touch on
think that
something. You touched on something I think is connected to the whole preterist thing, and even the whole Augustinian approach to looking at scripture and prophecy is the idea that the church has replaced Israel. And
yeah,
this becomes one of the biggest big arguments, and one thing that fosters a lot of the anti-Semitic feelings in the culture, because you look at the Middle Ages became incredibly anti-Semitic, in large part based upon Augustine's theology that the church has been replaced. And when you do that, one of the most central issues that should concern people when they hear that is, then God doesn't keep his promises. Because if God says forever, and suddenly we're saying, well, forever was only until this point in time. And suddenly basically what this does is it chips away the foundation stones of the word of God in people's lives. And little by little, they start stepping away from saying, obviously, I can't read it on my own, which gets us into Orthodox and Roman Catholic theology, where you can't read the Bible. You need somebody like a priest to interpret it. And all of that is creating this distance, this space between the individual and his own personal priesthood as a follower of Jesus Christ. And he begins to become supplanted by religious authorities. And you see it. I mean, you see how people are looking for some kind of authoritative voice. I think the COVID shutdowns and everything else was linked to that whole idea that this is what the authorities have said to us. And now we look back and realize that, now they're telling us wearing masks is actually extremely unhealthy, and social distance had no science behind it. We know the masks. You start hearing all this stuff, you just go, well, but the authorities said, and I think that's really where I know that there were people like us who, like our congregation, where we didn't close our church and took huge amounts of grief for that, which was fine enough. But the problem is that what were we basing those decisions on? Well, we spent time praying, fasting, seeking God. Should we do this or not? And the answer was no. You shouldn't shut down. And so we didn't. And I look back on it now and saying, thank God we didn't do that, because I mean, we never had a super spreader. We never had anything like that happen. But the reality is that we found out it was really kind of revealing to where churches were going, and the split that we've seen now between what I would say Orthodox and those of us who are biblicists and those who are not is becoming much more pronounced, more evident. And we're just, seeing the church go in this really unchurch-like direction.
yeah. Check this out. So this is Antonio Gramsci, who was a
Mhm.
1920s, 30s Marxist. He got thrown in jail by Mussolini, died there. That's what he said. He said, socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. In the new order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media by transforming the consciousness of society. And he's a Marxist. He's calling this a religion, and
Yeah.
we would say, yeah, Marxism is a religion.
Well, Antonio
Darwinian.
Gramsci was actually the
Good.
father of what's called Neomarxism.
Hmm.
And Neomarxism is not Marxism in the classic sense of what we think about communist Marxism. Neo-Marxism is the idea that a totalitarian elite should rule the masses. And he was the one who really came up with that idea that what we need to do is take control of, as we talk about the seven mountains of culture and so forth today, but the idea that this should be the responsibility of a select elite. So when you look at things like the World Economic Forum, you look at the United Nations, you look at the orientation of most major governments around the world, even the arrest of Telegram's CEO and so forth. I can't remember his name, but that kind of idea of the command and control of culture is the very thing that Gramsci was all about, which you just cited. But that's what is under the heading now of neo-Marxism, and people are looking for distinctly communist perspectives, like Das Kapital or something that Marx promoted. But the reality is, it's something that's going to come wrapped in a different robe. It's this idea that we need to let the elites run the world and tell us how things should be done. And that's, when I look at the Democratic, or the what I call the Democrats, the undemocratic party, their whole platform is this idea of increased authoritarianism, where we cede more and more of our culture to this group of elites. And so even to the point where their candidate for president is almost like a non-person. I mean, she could be an AI generated creature for all I know, because she has nothing to do really with what the party is about and where it's going. She's obviously not running the show or calling the shots. She's just a product that they're creating to sell to the public. And behind that is this promise of something, you'll be happier if you vote this way. And it's amazing to me how responsive people are in our day and age, that they don't have this ability I see a loss of critical thinking and being able to see through the facades. And, it's almost like the curtain is pulled back in The Wizard of Oz and they say, don't pay no attention to that man. Well, the reality is they look at that man, they see what he's doing, they know he's a fake, and they say, but he's so nice. He's so happy. I don't know.
I like that meme that's been going around here. They're talking about I'm going to butcher it if I try and say it, but something about the fact that like mice don't understand why the cheese is free on the trap, like until it's too late. I mean, yeah, I couldn't watch the DNC. I mean, I would it would trigger my PTSD in all kinds of ways. I just couldn't sit through it. But I went back and listened to the highlights, and there was no policy. There's no platform that they were going to project forward. It was all like, I like how Glenn Beck put it. He said in a tweet, he said that the Democrats need you to hate Trump more than you hate fentanyl and all this opioid crisis. They want you to hate Trump more than you hate abortion. They want you to hate Trump more than you hate the open border crisis and the human trafficking. And he goes down all the list. And so they've turned this really that whole political week was really just hate Trump, vote Democrat. That's just their message. And then on CNN yesterday or today, I was watching, they're saying, and it was a roundtable, and they were like, when are they going to take Biden's name off all of their little platform stuff they have for the next 4 years, because it's all his name is all over the what they're going to put forth as their platform. And they're like, well, we don't really have that just yet, and we were going to just kind of hang back and basically we're going to we're going to hide her until the election. We're not going to we're going to remain vague on everything and not put our foot on any, stand on any place. And then once we get in, it's kind of like Pelosi said, we have to pass it in order to read it, whatever the
Right.
bill is. So they have to get her elected to see what kind of leader she's going to turn out to be, or whoever's the
Well,
puppet master behind her.
I would just say that avoiding any kind of statements is kind of historically characteristic of Kamala Harris. I mean, you go all the way back to when she was the DA in San Francisco and the Attorney General in California and so forth. She never would allow any kind of, she gave no press conferences. She wouldn't answer letters. She wouldn't grant interviews. That's been her MO from the very beginning, because she's really a pretty vapid person. There's really not a lot in there. And so, that's not unusual for her. And I think that's a very smart tactic. But I think what it really, I think, is important for most of us to understand as Christians is that this really isn't about politics. This is, because as soon as we look at an individual or a group of individuals and we say, we make a distinction, it's called politics, and Christians shouldn't get involved in politics, which I think is another false theology that the church has bought into. But the reality is, it really is so much more serious than that. It's not something that's just happening within our own borders. This is something that's happening across the world. So that we see this gravitation towards various forms of authoritarianism and despotism, that we can look at China, we can look at Russia, and certainly see the extremes of North Korea, but it's happening in France, it's happening in Britain, it's happening in Australia, it's happening in Sweden, where you find that the governments are increasingly taking away the rights and freedoms of individuals and calling it democracy. But what they're doing is they're just squeezing everybody into the same circumference and saying, this is where you'll live. And I think that's where we have to understand that this is ultimately one of the things I was just working on, about how that, in terms of, because we're teaching through the book of Revelation right now in my church, which we've been there for, I just finished, I'm on week number 52, so it's going to be a quick, and I'm almost halfway through. But I keep on getting lost in the weeds. But I think that it's really amazing to me, because what we see happening is this really narrowing down of people's freedoms in an effort, because Satan is not omnipresent. He can't be everywhere. He can only be one place. He's a created being that only be one place at a time, and therefore he has to have a central control of the universe in order for him to rule over mankind. And I think that we need to understand this is ultimately the motivation. He's been pushing to do this since the Tower of Babel, and he's attempting to, even when we talk about depopulation, because part of the problem I think he had before the flood, when he deceived Adam and Eve, he had tremendous power and control over the amount of humanity was there. But within 1,500 years, there are millions and millions of people, and so he's still trying to control them, and he couldn't control 8 people who got in the boat and survived the flood. But I think that's never ceased to be his agenda from the very beginning. And I think it's going to be his agenda to the very end. And until God allows him, no longer restrains, he lets it play out, and then he'll be able to accomplish it for a moment. Because in Revelation, as soon as the Antichrist manifests himself for who he is and takes control, it says very clearly, John says, the time is short. This is the beginning of the end, because God's letting this thing play out, and he's allowing it to reveal itself for how diabolical it is. And I think for you and I as Christians, this is what we have to begin to prepare ourselves for, that until the Lord comes, we're going to find that evil men are going to wax worse and worse. It's not we're going to elect Donald Trump and suddenly the world's going to get fixed. Now, I will add this, forgive me for droning on and on and on. I don't think I think that all things are preordained, but I don't think they're predestined. And what I mean by that is I don't know that there's going to be a second coming. I know there's going to be a tribulation. I know these things are coming, but the time frame, and I think the reason Jesus said no man knows the day or the hour, he said even myself, but only the Father, is because it's predicated to some degree on our response to God. So when he says, if my people will pray, I'll heal their land. When Hezekiah says, God, don't let me die, God gave him 15 years. Josiah, I won't do it in your lifetime. When he says to Abraham, if you can find 10 righteous, I'll spare Sodom and Gomorrah. And so what I keep on telling people is that we need to understand that our response in these times can affect the time frames in which we're living in. So I don't want people to think, and that's where I think the church has fallen into this complacency of, well, whatever's going to happen is going to happen. And what we realize is that we are supposed to be salt and light into the culture. And that's part of that is voting. Part of that is being intelligent and informed, being able to engage and say, this is nuts. This is insanity. And I think that's why I've become kind of passionate about that. And I've been criticized widely, saying, well, your Christian pastor shouldn't be involved in politics. It's not politics. But I can tell you this quite honestly, from personal view, I spent a lot of time in Russia. I've seen what life was behind the Iron Curtain. Believe me, I do not want to go back to a totalitarian system. I mean, I've seen it too many places in the world, and it's pretty horrible. And it does create an equality. We become equally miserable and poor. That's all it does. But it gives, and that's what you have today. We're still working in Russia, and I don't know if we're going to get back in again, considering the way things are deteriorating. But it's basically, they've never been out from under a totalitarian system. And one of my Russian friends put it really well, because somebody was asking about the coming election, what I think will happen. I said, well, I'm fearful that we're getting to the same place that it is in Russia, where my friends would say to them, they pretend to put on elections and we pretend to vote. And I feel like that's kind of what's happening in this country. We'll see how this thing turns out in November. But, reality is, if the current administration is able to continue, the current regime to hold on to power as they will, then I think that we have moved into that pretend zone. We're pretending to have elections, but democracy is no longer truly functional, especially in the Republican form in which it was founded.
Yeah, I've told my audience, both written and on here, that when Jesus was shown the coin, and he's like, "Show me the coin. Whose image is on that?" And they're like, "Caesar." And he's like, "Well, render under Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God." Where for us, we render to our form of government, which is a constitutional republic. We have to render unto Caesar, the government, a vote. If we don't vote, then we get lawlessness, and
Yeah,
lawlessness is where we sit back and we don't get involved, and then the next thing you know, your town turns into Portland, or it turns into
yeah,
San Francisco, it turns into Los Angeles, or some of these other places that have just become hellholes. That you don't want to live there.
yeah,
You don't even want to visit there, or do business there, or anything. And I feel like you're right. We need to be involved in society. Yes, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I can both be excited about the Lord's coming, and be watching and waiting, but I'm also going to serve locally in my community, or I'm going to be involved in other things. Anything I can get involved in, I will and have. So between jail ministry and school boards and nursing homes, I've been involved in just a number of different kinds of things and over the years, and um, but that's never dampened my watching and waiting for the Lord. And I hate that dichotomy that we get thrown into. Like, as soon as you tell somebody you're a dispensationalist or premillennial, pre-trib, whatever, that's just all, they kind of pigeonhole you into that and think that's all you can do, or all you can do is sit and wait on a hill for the Lord to return. I'm like, no,
yeah,
I do a lot of things. In fact, I'm doing them more now, because when I wasn't watching and waiting, I was very apathetic and complacent to the things of God. I didn't care. I was like, well, that's a million
yeah.
years away, whatever. Um, but I you brought up, you were the guy that had talked about, speaking about lawlessness. You were the guy that I first heard from, that had talked about that book by Bud
Jay
Szynski. Yes,
Budaszewski.
what we can't not know.
Yeah,
And I love that, and I went back and read through, not all of it, but I read through parts of it and chunks of it and stuff. But the four things that there's a Reverend David Coe that took out of this book, the four witnesses. He calls it the deep conscious, the witness of a design as such, the witness of our own design, and the witness of natural consequences. And so I want to touch on these in relation to Matthew 24, 12. And it says in there, or I'm going to start at 11. It says, "Then many false witnesses will rise up and deceive many. Because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold." So
hmm,
these things I'm just going to call them Bud. What Bud talks about with the deep conscious, it's the interior source for our moral inklings. Quote, "It's the reason why even a man who tells himself there is no right from wrong will still shrink away from committing murder. The witness of a design as such, which is a recognition that nature requires an explanation beyond itself, that the things in nature are designed, that design requires personal agency, namely God. The next one is the witness of our own design, which is the recognition everything in our design has a purpose and is well used when it is used for that purpose. And the last one is the witness of natural consequences, which is the recognition that when we act against the purposes for which we in the world um, were designed, there are natural consequences. Bud repeatedly zeroes in on the sexual revolution, with separated sex from procreation within marriage, and the consequences are numerous: single moms, poverty, adolescence violence, venereal disease, child abuse, abortion, etc. And I think Jesus giving when he gave the discourse on the Mount of Olives there about the last days, his disciples, and when he mentions this lawlessness, I think we just kind of all assume crime, murder, that kind of stuff, mayhem, riots, and that is part of it, yes. But I think there's a deeper lawlessness that have been going on when we begin to rebel against these things that we know that are inherently or innately the God-shaped hole, the God consciousness that everybody has within them. When we rebel against that, that is also a form of lawlessness. and it's manifesting at a personal level, individual level. Your lawlessness is you're not living how God designed you to live, or the purpose is you're in rebellion against God, and that's going to throw everything in the rest of your life into chaos. Now multiply that by tens of millions of people in the United States alone, and then billions in the world. You can see why the world is in the mess that it is. And
Yeah.
I think that was a very insightful book. And I don't know, it had a huge impact on me. So I want to thank you for introducing me to that to begin
Yeah.
with. But um, your thoughts?
Well, I think the book itself is one of the most important documents that's been written in the 20th century, actually 21st century.
Mhm.
Budashevsky, who's a philosophy professor of philosophy at University of Texas, um, doesn't really come out and say he's a Christian, but he has such a clearly Christian point of view. And the whole premise of the book is basically he begins to show how the Ten Commandments are fulfilled in every aspect of our life. And I think that's part of the idea that his contention, and I think it's the biblical contention, that morality, the idea of right and wrong, is hardwired into our being. And one of the ways I often illustrate is saying, how old was your child, your first child, before he or she said, "That's not fair"? And you sit back and go, well, where did this concept that something is fair or not fair come from? It's not necessarily like we taught them this, but they recognize that something just wasn't right. When they start saying mine, that statement of ownership realizes that some things belong to me and some things do not belong to me. We may have to give them parameters and modify them, but this distinction in life, where we call some things good and we call some things evil, is something that's hardwired into us. And that's where the moral compass that humans have is unique to humanity. What I find interesting is that there's an effort within the culture to try to always imbue the animal world with the same kind of moral values, saying, look at the whale mourning over the orcas eating its baby, or the chimpanzee who is mourning over the loss of her child. And we try to create some kind of moral equivalency out of that. The simple fact is that we're the only beings who ever sat down and reasonably and logically codified the rules of behavior that are going to govern everybody else. And as long as people are in agreement about that, things go pretty smoothly. When they disagree, that's where the conflict arises. And I think that's part of what we see happening is when we talk about lawlessness, it's basically not only going against the internal sense of what is right and wrong, but basically making myself the arbiter of what's right and wrong, that I'm the arbiter of what's true and what's good. So my feelings or my opinions, my moment, or however I identify myself at a particular moment, that's the basis by which things are interpreted. And what that leads ultimately is to confusion and chaos. So what Budashevsky does is in a very intellectual and reasonable way, kind of destroy that whole idea that I am the center of the universe, that there is a greater power, a greater sense that has governed human society. And that's why essentially historians have said you can find the Ten Commandments in every civilization that we can trace back to the ancient Sumerians in Mesopotamia up until the present day. And you form any group, any club, even people who are a bunch of miscreants who are behaving badly and they gang together. The gang always has a set of rules. It's these things that we abide by, that these are the good. This is when you're stealing from me. This is when you're harming me. This is when you're being, it's just inherent. And it's so obvious and so evident that people don't see it because it's so ubiquitous. And this is where I think that when you talk about the rise and falls of cultures, um, this is always the death knell. This is what Sir John Glubb was talking about when he talked about the decay of nations, the fall of empires. That suddenly the glue that holds us together begins to disassociate. And I think it was interesting because one I can't remember her name now, but one art historian who deals with a lot of the philosophy, who herself is a lesbian, has said basically as she's studied the art history of the world, she's realized that the final stage of a nation is when they become androgynous. He says you follow the art of every culture when androgyny begins to come in. Um, that she said that's the beginning of the end of any culture. And she said it was true of the Greeks, the Romans, the Persians, the Babylonians. Just go right through history, and you can see this idea that suddenly sexual identity becomes blurred. And that's when the culture begins to find, because at that point, what you've lost is the foundation stones of a culture, and that is the family.
Well, yeah, that's the if you go back to postmodernism, the thought of it and what the end state will be, ultimately it moves you through these transitions from varying flavors of social. You get through the causes, the crisis, and then those kind of morph into some form of socialism, but ultimately those end in communism, right? But if you also look at what's the end state from Satan's perspective, from a spiritual component, it's not just postmodernism, but I think we're moving into posthumanism,
Yeah.
to where we are. When you think about intersectionality and how you put people in groups and victim classes and all this kind of stuff, and then gender becomes this one of the keystones of the intersectional movement. But then when you blur gender to such a degree that there's 60 something different gender identities or whatever, 100 or 1,000, I don't even know what they are anymore. But then I think it's to get us past human. And I did ask when I was an instructor at a military academy, I had a soldier that was transgendered, and I never referred to him as as a her or anything. I just called him Captain so and so. And I just asked him out of the blue one day. I was like, "Hey, do you think that at least in the trans community, do you feel like that what you're doing now is simply a stepping stone to move us to beyond something beyond human? Because if we can't recognize gender anymore, then that's kind of the final defining thing about
Yeah.
a person. If you can't get that, if that's all blurry and muddied in terms of muddy in the waters, then what's left is that what does it mean to be human anymore? And so I think Satan, at least from his perspective, is pushing everybody in that direction,
Yeah.
so that when you take the mark, it does make you more than human or less than human. But either way, Christ came and died for mankind. He did not come and die for hybrids or for these whatever. He didn't die for the angels. He didn't die for the Nephilim. He didn't die for any of these chimera type people. He came to die for mankind. So I think it does something, and I think it's in some way, shape, or form that is not known to us at the present. It's moving the whole. If you look at the whole big picture, it's moving that whole thing to move us to accept this thing that is beyond human.
Hmm.
And I know that ties in with a lot with all of the Elon Musk stuff, the Neuralink and the chip and the for me it ties in with the mark of the beast, but I don't know exactly how. I don't know what your thoughts are on that. I feel like I'm stretching. I know what I want to say. I just don't know if I can get the words right and how I want to frame it.
Yeah. I have friends who are a lot more convinced of the process of transhumanism than I can speak to. I mean, but I'll tell you what, I think that one of my podcasts, what I did is I focused on the effect of evolution within our culture and within society and within the church. I think that evolution is the biggest false doctrine that ever came into the church, because most 80% of Christians believe in evolution. And again, not recognizing how antithetical that is to a biblical worldview. And so the problem is that what you 20, 30 years ago, in dealing with the issue of the rise of same-sex marriage and homosexuality and everything within the culture, one of the things that was beginning to stand out was that many of the people who were making the argument for homosexuality and same-sex marriage is they really believed that they were evolutionarily evolved above and beyond the rest of us, that homosexuality was a part of that evolutionary process. And when you talk about transhumanism, it's the idea that we self-created somehow in that primordial ooze. We decided that we were going to be, and we self-created ourselves, and everything is self-created. And so as a consequence, we can continue to progress the idea that every way we're getting better and better. And so it's really kind of a mindset, a belief system that people have, that we are not uniquely created by God, but rather, in the biblical model is we're not progressing, we're regressing. We went from living nearly 1,000 years to here I'm almost 75 and I'm 2 years past my life expectancy. So it's when we look at this, the biblical view is saying we're going downhill. The culture is saying no, we're progressing further and further. And the idea is that we can make the decision that we can put a neural link in our brain, which on one hand you look and saying that's wonderful if people can develop ability out of it. But what it does is it also deceives us into thinking that we are the masters of our own fate, that we are the captains of our ship. And the truth of the matter is we're not. We're much more controlled by things around us that are out of our control than anything that's within our control.
Yeah, that was from Invictus, I think. This idea
Yeah.
that we were a captive of our own
Yeah.
fate. Um, well, let's unpack a little bit of the impacts of postmodernism, and I want to touch on how that's impacting the rise of neo-paganism, the resurgence of Wiccan, and all of the other things, even Satanism, and how that's part of those things that are blossoming in this the fruit of all this nearly a century of postmodernism in the mess that we find ourselves in, because I think we are become, and somebody posted in the chat and remind me to look it up, but it's in Judges, the last passage in Judges 21. It says, so the children of Israel departed from there at the time, every man to his tribe and family, and they went out from there, and every man to his inheritance. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And I feel like we're there, even just within the church. I can't think of another time
Yeah.
in the last 2,000 years where the church has been this divided amongst denominations, groups, sects, branches. Even the Catholic Church, I didn't know that, I had to look this up, but the Catholic Church is divided 8 different ways, between Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox. I mean, there's just on and on. But within the Protestant side, it's just, I mean, I don't even know. I think it was 2 or 3 thousand different types of denominations the last I'd heard,
Yeah.
and that was a few years ago. I don't know where we are today. I think everything's becoming like non-denominational for the most part, but um, impacts of postmodernism. Let's see. We got relativism, the skepticism inherent to that, deconstruction, pluralism, fragmentation, rejection of objective reality, focus on power and language, the deconstruction of the Judeo-Christian worldview. And I think that's where that other stuff ties in, the pagan, Wiccan, and all that. That when you take, nature abhors a vacuum. So when you take something out of the marketplace of ideas and what's being, really heralded as the glue that holds your society together, you're not just leaving it open as an open vacuum. Something or some many things are going to rush in and fill that vacuum. And I
Yeah.
feel like that's really what we've seen happen over the latter half of the 20th century, up to the point where you get the Harry Potter popularizes Wiccan, and then it begins to normalize it. The Marvel movies and comics begin to popularize a lot of the Greek gods and Norse gods like Thor and Zeus and all these different characters. And then those become characters we grow up with, and then they make movies about them, and it's, wow, it looks cool, And then next thing you know, there's a new Norse pagan religion spouting up in Norway or somewhere,
Yeah.
reviving those churches, the Celts, the Druids. I mean, on and on and on.
Yeah.
And this is old, right? I mean, this has been going on since the Theosophical movement, at least in my mind, since the
Yeah.
1870s or so. So Eastern mysticism is creeping back in, paganism is creeping back in, Satanism, Luciferianism, whatever you want to call it. All of these things are rushing back in, and now we as a society, we're no longer, I honestly believe we're very much post-Christian in the sense of, I guess, a national identity. There are large segments of Christians still in the United States, but that's quickly being eroded away through this fragmentation of denominations and the political divides, cultural divides, and now the spiritual components rushing back in, and has since the 60s, I guess, with
Mhm.
the Beatles popularizing Eastern mysticism and Hinduism and all that.
Yeah. Well,
And
I think you
you were the quintessential Beatle fan, were you not?
I was
Back.
a quintessential hippie. I was I was well, yeah, I was fully enveloped in the alternative culture to the chagrin of my parents. It's funny because even with my dad, though, it's like, they kind of overlooked a lot of those, that the whole hippie thing. It was a little embarrassing, but they overlooked it. But when I became a Christian, my dad asked my mom the question, where do we go wrong? And I think that what we realize is, I think that Musk and Dawkins and others have really put a finger on it when they talk about, they identify as cultural Christians, because they recognize that the Christian ethic for running life and a society is much healthier and better for culture than is a pagan view or any of these other variations on that, iterations. But the simple fact is that there has never really been a majority. To say that America was a Christian culture, I would say that the founding fathers were strongly influenced from a biblical worldview, but they were more also influenced by the Roman Republic. And they really were trying to create a new Rome in the sense of the Roman Republic, not the empire, but the new Rome. And the idea that our form of government, our language, half of our language has Latin roots in it, 60% of it, but all of our legal systems, and even I came up with 150 different legal terms that are all directly from the Latin, talking about the medical field, the scientific world. In other words, this whole culture that it looked at the ethics and the morality of Christianity, but it took upon itself the form of the Roman Republic as a system of government. And I think that as Christians began to say, well, America was founded as a Christian nation, is not accurate. I mean, that's why they gave freedom of religion. They saw the value of that. And it's a place where Christianity could flourish and has flourished, but it's become a cultural dynamic, not a spiritual dynamic. And that's why I think always there's only been probably at most 10% of the population has been truly what I call born again believers in Jesus Christ. And that's why when we find that as life begins to face certain challenges, we have come under the sway of so many cultural influences, so that what we find even within many churches is kind of this hybrid Christianity. It's a blending of evolution is science, and politics is evil, and abortion is okay under certain circumstances, and you just have all of these things that are antithetical to biblical Christianity being accepted as being under the umbrella of Christianity, so that when we look at the vast majority of churches, they really have no forensic right to call themselves Christian at all. Because it's like the old Clairol commercial used to say, about hair dye, only your hairdresser will know for sure. I mean, a lot of people, how do we know whether or not you're really a Christian? Because there's nothing about you that's going to lead to your conviction. And so that's what we used to always say when I was a young believer. If you were arrested for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? And I think that increasingly that's not the case.
That is very true. That is true. Yeah, you got to think. I guess when I think about the Judeo-Christian influence on the nation, I start back at the Pilgrims coming over, and I don't remember exactly the flavor that they were, Anabaptists maybe, or
Yeah. And
Mennonites, or something
they
to that
were
effect.
biblicists. They were true biblicists.
Yeah, that and probably uh, people I probably would not get along with today. I mean, I would be so far out of the norm for them, that even my thoughts and stuff. But uh, but then over the course of the next 100 years, 150 years, you get to the 1770s, 1780s, and then you're right. I mean, they're taking in Rousseau, they're taking in Locke, and all these different philosophers, and then looking at the perfect form of government, blending that with the Greco-Roman philosophies, and I always use the passage, Acts 17:26, that God sets the times and the boundaries of the nations, and so on and so forth. And it was a mystery that we exist in a mystery form, in my opinion, because there's no country that's ever existed like us before, or
Right.
not in the way that we do. And yes, there was freedom of religion because Christianity affords that, and says, if Christianity could stand its own merits, and can, in the public arena of ideas, can compete and dominate every time, which is why they spent the last 100 years shutting down Christianity, and not being able to talk about it in public or in the schools or in government or anywhere else. And they've allowed all these other kind of ideas to crop up, Darwinianism, everything that stemmed from that, nihilism and all the different isms that have come about. But I feel like we're definitely a mess right now. We're very much fragmented as a nation politically. I think at the Civil War time frame, we were really divided over two or three major issues: slavery, states' rights, and I don't know if there's a third. But now, I mean, there's probably a good 20 different issues that people are hotly divided over, that are in their minds the hills to die on kind of thing.
Hmm.
Anything from abortion to national security to the national debt, the economy, everything. So I don't know how we put Humpty Dumpty back together again. I think we're kind of done. But if and my thoughts on this were, if Trump wins, and I kind of do believe that he will. This election cycle to me reminds me very much of 2016, where they threw everything in the kitchen sink at him to get him to drop out or to not run, or then once he was the primary candidate, um, they bred all the legal stuff, and they started hitting him early on, and then it was just a foregone conclusion that Clinton was going to win. And so when she didn't win, it was a surprise. And I feel like it's very much that way now, where he's gone through 9 years of just having everything thrown at him, two impeachments, a bunch of different investigations. He's had his life turned upside down. He's had his house literally turned upside down, Mar-a-Lago. And I mean, just an assassination attempt, everything that they've done, just for whatever reason, it's not worked the way that they thought it would. And and I know this is tongue in cheek, a little bit of divine irony from my point, but if the rapture does happen under Trump's second term, it would be at the last Trump, in my opinion. So I know that's old joke or whatever, but I feel like, man, I feel like we're in that window. I feel like we're in a window of time. I don't know the day or the hour.
Yeah.
But when I go back to Hosea 5:15 through 6:3 and in some other passages, anything that's got time kind of associated with it, one of my old mentors, a guy named Don Koenig, he had a "When Will Jesus Return?" and it was an article that he wrote back in 2007, and he had a table on there with every passage that had time associated with it, and then he had all the major views, all the major theories, and all the and this is 2007, so people were really hyped about 2011 because 2011 was 7 years from 2018, which was the 70th anniversary of Israel, and you can go on and on, right? So every year there's some new thing, new spin on something, but I remember reading that in 2008 or 2009 and just becoming incredibly discouraged, because he was like, I think the earliest Christ could come back is in the mid 2020s at the earliest. And
Hmm.
I said, probably at the latest, mid 2030s. And
Yeah.
then you got to factor in the second coming time frame. And he's looking at second coming, not the rapture. So I remember reading that back then, and that really influenced me and impacted me. And I took it to heart because I knew Don is a solid teacher on basically every subject. But I thought, he's saying the unpopular thing right now out loud, and he's
Hmm.
catching a lot of grief for it. Because if back in 2007, the last thing you wanted to hear was the rapture was at the earliest in the mid 20s. So,
Yeah.
but now that we're in the mid 20s, I feel like, man, we're here. Like it's hard to believe it, but I don't I don't know how much like, it seems like there's so many things already laid on digital currency, the Neuralink. I mean, the technology to do all the things that the technological capabilities that are mentioned in Revelation 13. It seems like we're there, and the geopolitical world is also shaping up very much the way that Ezekiel 38 and other passages have talked about. So I don't know how much longer we have, but I feel like I mean, obviously we're closer than we were then, but like, I feel like we're there. Like, and wouldn't it be ironic? And I'm not saying Trump's a Christian. I'm not saying he's a Messiah. I'm not giving him anything. I'm just saying, just his last name alone. If in the Bible it said at the last um, uh, horn blast, and let's say it was President Donald Blast was his name. Like, what are the odds of that? Just it, but it is, and so I don't know. I don't know how much of this, if it happens in the second iteration, it would be ironic, in my opinion.
Well, I think that that's why Jesus said, and we need to watch and be ready. I think that,
Yeah.
and when I look at the United States of America, I do believe that God has specially worked in this nation. But many years ago, I used to share when I would teach on the end times. I said I think there are two things that are necessary for America to continue to be blessed. And number one is that we are committed to reaching the world for Christ. So we have been the major evangelistic vehicle that God has used in the 20th century. In the 19th century, that was Great Britain, when Great Britain reached its greatest points, and then it began to pull back from mission work, and they began to fail as a nation. The other thing I say is our relationship with Israel. That God said he would bless those who bless Israel, and he'll curse those who don't. And that's where I think that the two things that I see happening now is missions is beginning to wane in terms of a focus within the church today. Less and less. I saw this turn during the whole seeker-sensitive movement, where the idea was we need to focus on our own people instead of focusing around the world. And I remember sharing this with a pastor friend of mine in Germany when he was getting pressures from his congregation to stop evangelism. He started with a couple of kids in the park and built one of the biggest evangelical church in all of Europe. And this thing was just exciting. And they wanted him now to focus upon the people in the church. We need to take care of our kids and their needs. And I shared with him, he asked me to tell my view. I said, I think that the one way you kill your church is become inwardly focused. That as long as you are looking just simply at taking care of yourselves, you'll stop doing the Great Commission. And when you stop doing the Great Commission, you're going to stop being effective. Now, I have my own view about the Great Commission. My pastor taught me that healthy sheep beget healthy sheep. So the best way I can impact the culture is to help make sure my people know the Word of God and are trying to live it so they can impact their neighbors and friends. But at the same time, the ultimate goal is that we should go into all the world and preach the gospel, see people get saved. That's why when we were doing mission work in Russia, we did church planting, not evangelism. I mean, we did evangelism, but we were trying to plant churches because we knew that if anything was going to continue, it had to come out of the church. That's Jesus' ordained organization. And so as I look at what's happening in our culture today, I see this not only in the moral decline. I mean, we're no longer what you would call a good people. I mean, we are murdering babies by the multiple millions. Revoking Roe versus Wade only slowed it down for a little bit. They found new ways to continue, as the Democratic Convention just proved. But they also, we're the primary purveyor of pornography. We're the primary consumers of sexual slavery. It's just so incredibly wicked, and we're even forcing this whole agenda of abortion and LGBTQ stuff through the United Nations, through our aid, where we're saying basically you can't get aid unless you're willing to subscribe to these values that we have. I mean, we have become really a sewer pipe into the rest of the world. And most Christians, and even certainly most Americans, most Christians still see us as being basically a good nation. But by biblical definition, we're courting disaster. And, I keep on saying to people, how long do you think that God is going to withhold his judgment? I had one of our ministries that we work with, pro-life groups here in our own community. The director said to me, he said, the millennial pastors don't want us coming in and sharing about our mission, which is basically both. I mean, it's holistic. They take care of everything from pregnancy to housing to everything need a woman would have, as well as education and information. And she said, they told me that our people have abortion fatigue. And I thought, abortion fatigue. I mean, it's just this incredible thought that it's almost like saying to the Jews, which America and other countries did during the Holocaust. We said, we've got Jewish fatigue. We've got Holocaust fatigue. We don't want any more Jews. We don't want to even think about this problem. And then it became so large and horrific that everybody pretended like they didn't know, but they did. And I think from the Germans right up to the United States government, everybody knew what was going on. They just didn't want to deal with it. And I think that's where we're at, is culturally. Again, we're at this point where we have these terrible, pustulous lesions of wickedness in our culture, and we don't want to deal with it. We want to pretend it's not that big a deal. It's not that happening. And I just think that, as Acts 17 says, well, God winked at certain things. How long does God sit back and? Because one of the things that Paul said very clearly, both in chapter 14, again, chapter 17 of Acts, is that there came a point when Christ came into the world that God said, okay, from this point forward, men are accountable. They're going to have to give account. This is going to be the measuring rod right here. It's Jesus Christ, him crucified, yea, resurrected. And those who accept that, God will bless them. Those who reject that, the curse will be upon them. So even in a culture where you have like we had a common value system that I grew up with. My parents weren't Christians, but they had Christian values. My mom taught me the 10 Commandments. She taught me the Lord's Prayer. She taught me John 3:16. That was the extent of my biblical information. But she thought that was important that I understood those things. My teachers in literature, even in college, understood you had to understand the biblical stories in order to understand great literature. No longer. So I had a granddaughter who submitted a paper using biblical quotes, and the teacher sent it back and said, "You can only use original sources." What an idiot. She doesn't know there's no more original source out there than the scriptures. I mean, we're talking about going back to, at least 1500 BC. You don't get any older, more original. And yet we live in such a time of cultural ignorance. And the problem is what's gone out with the bathwater is the baby. We've gotten rid of the very foundation upon which our culture rests. So just the fact that we once had this shared common value system in America, they weren't all Christians, but we all understood. I remember when I was growing up that if you simply said to a man who used profanity, "Hey, there are women and children here," they'd automatically begin profusely to apologize, say, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I know I shouldn't have done that." And they would never use God's name in a curse because that was taking God's name in vain. These were things that were part of the value system. And I think God honored that. And I think that's a lot of the prosperity and blessing we've experienced. We saw God intervene in America's behalf throughout our history. And I think what we see with Trump's near assassination, I can only attribute that to the miracle of God. The fact that he's still a candidate is a miracle of God. I'm just living in this fear that if the church doesn't begin to humble themselves and pray and seek his face and confess their sins, our sins, that we're going to withhold the healing that God can bring. And I don't think it's going to come through Donald Trump, although I think that God will use Donald Trump or anybody for that matter. I mean, back in 2020, I did something that I had never done before in my history. As a pastor, I said, I'm encouraging you to vote for Donald Trump. And I said, for one reason. He's the only candidate in my lifetime who has strongly come out against abortion. I've never seen, George Bush didn't do it. Ronald Reagan didn't do it. Nobody came out against it in the same way. And I said, for that reason alone, if Joe Biden would come out and say, I'm going to do everything I can to end abortion, then I would have voted for Joe Biden. Not because I agree with his policy, but I think that is central to our cultural survival above and beyond everything. Because when I look at the judgments that God brought upon Judah, he pointed down to Tophet, to the babies whose cries were being drummed out by the drums as they were being laid upon the altar to Molech and Chemosh. And I think that God said, it never even entered into my mind to think that you would serve me in that way. And when I hear pastors now talking about abortion as being necessary and all the other stuff, I mean, I just sit here and I'm dumbfounded. I'm stunned. I just think, what do I say to that? It's so wicked coming out of the from a pulpit. I don't know.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
I preach.
When Roe v. Wade, when that was reversed, the pulpit minister we had, he didn't mention anything about any rejoicing about the potential lives saved from it. He simply was, well, we need to pray for the pregnant women or something to that effect. That was about the extent of it. Like, I'm like, do you not read the Bible? Because like these cultures that God wipes out because of the child sacrificing and all the other wicked stuff they did, but that was key. But Charlie Kirk from Turning Point USA, is a big Donald Trump fan. He's a big proponent of free speech, etc. He had a quote, and I don't agree with Charlie Kirk I agree with him most of the cultural stuff, and I agree with him on even the governmental stuff. I think where I kind of part ways with him is maybe in the eschatology of things and like how he thinks potentially that making America great again could also extend America's future going forward, and a lot of that stems from postmillennial thought. I'm not saying he's postmillennial, but I'm just saying that's kind of the mindset there, that the church reclaims the world, and then Christ can return, kind of that fashion.
Yeah.
But he said something that I thought was poignant, and I've kind of used it a few times. He said, um, when discussing neo-paganism and all that kind of the culture that's moved back into the United States, he said the problem is that many gods equals many moralities. And I thought, man, that makes a lot of sense. And that dovetails right in, that flows right in with postmodernism,
Yeah.
and then all the other things that fall underneath the umbrella of postmodernism. In the same vein, in my opinion, that preterism if preterism can go in under the guise of amillennialism, or can go under the guise of postmillennialism. It fits both perfectly, or can be used either way. But it can't fit into premillennialism. It's so uh, counterintuitive to those two thoughts, or two
Yeah.
dichotomous from each other. They can't work together. And I feel like we're at that point now where we've got so many different cultures with all their own gods. Even in the RNC convention, where you had a Sheik, or a Sikh giving the Sikh prayer, and then you had Amber Rose, who was I don't know if she's a Satanist, or she's leans that way or whatever. I don't even know. I didn't know who she was until she got up
Yeah.
and spoke. But
That's good.
yeah, but point is that even within the RNC, they've got to make the umbrella so big, the tent so big, that they fit
Yeah.
all these different groups in. And so the difference between, I know people complain about the binary system we're in, but if you go to the UK, you go to Israel, you go to these other places, they have these coalitions. They have to hobble together these coalitions in order to get the majority, and then out of that coalition, they bring up their leader, whoever the prime minister is going to be. Here we have all those coalitions already kind of prepackaged in these two parties,
Yeah.
and there has been cross pollination between the two over the years. Whereas the Republican Party was a party of freedom, anti-slavery. It had a lot of the African Americans that grew up from the 1850s and forward were Republican up until about the 1960s, and then there was a flipping of the two. And now I think that flip has happened again here in the 2020s, where the minorities communities are looking at the last 40 years and recognizing, like, hey, we've been voting Democrat all this time, and everything is just getting worse and worse and worse. Like, they don't care, And
Yeah.
then they're bringing in illegals from Venezuela, from all the different countries, and it's not even they're good people. It's like they're emptying their prison systems and kicking them out and making them march north. And so now those gangs are competing with our gangs, the native borns, and now there's the potential threat of war, between just the rival gangs in the United States,
Yeah.
say between MS-13 and the Crips or the Bloods or whoever.
Yeah.
But last point here, and then we need to take some questions. Um, I feel like uh, we're in the last moments of the last days. I know Hebrews 1 and 2 says that from Christ's time forward we've been in the last days, but I feel like we're at the tippy point of the spear now on this. In your mind, in your opinion, are there any signs? Are there any things about the last days that have surprised you, or caught you off guard, or even, and you can start it from whatever year forward, but like, is there anything that surprised you about, aside from the fact that we're still here? you know
Yeah. I think what surprised me is how exactly and literally the Bible foretold the events that we're seeing happen. I remember when I was teaching in a Bible school back in back in the 70s, mid 70s, and it was interesting because I was sharing with them about Ezekiel 38 and 39, and I was saying, I said, I don't know how it's going to happen, because at the time Iran, Persia, was an ally of Israel. And basically the Shah supported Israel, and it was part of the U.S. system, and all that sort of stuff. And so I was saying, I don't know how this can happen, but someday in the future, Iran is going to become the primary enemy of Israel. But how that's going to happen, I just have to know that the Word of God says that, but I don't know how. And then, of course, not too long after that, the Shah was overthrown, and they became, to this day, the prominent enemy of Israel and seeking their destruction. And we are working towards, I think we're certainly heading towards in Ezekiel 38 and 39. So I don't know. God can compress or extend time any way he wants, since it's something that he created in the first place. But so I never really try to give a date. Anytime somebody says, well, I think it's going to happen at this date, I say, well, we obviously know, if we know the date, it's the wrong date. And because Jesus said we wouldn't know the date, so that's probably not the date. But I think at the same time, I don't see anything that needs to happen for the church to be taken out of here. And that's why I think that we talk about the imminent return of Christ. I don't think that there's any event that I'm looking to scripturally that has to transpire. I think we're already there. And I think that one of the things we have to realize, just looking at our own recent history, I mean, when you think about 6 months ago, what we thought was going to be happening today, and we realized that, we've got changes in candidates, we've got assassination attempts, we've got all sorts. I mean, so many things. It's like every day you listen to the news, and it's a whole series of new things that are going on. It's happening so fast. There's almost like an exponential increase in events that are piling up and pushing us forward at a faster and faster rate. So I basically go to bed tonight, each night, and go, Lord, if you come to take me tonight, that's okay, because I just, I don't know that I don't know that I will live to a ripe old age of anything, but I know that I live every day in the expectancy that this could be my last moments, and I, even to the point of saying, we may not finish this podcast before Jesus takes us home. I mean, to me, it's that we're just living in that seriousness of time.
Yeah, I think for me, the what's been most um, surprising is how obvious some of this is. Like the
Yeah,
digital currency, the central bank digital currency. Um, to me, if a guy like Joe Rogan can read Revelation 13 and put two and two together of those things, a guy that's mocked Christianity, mocked Christ, not
yeah,
definitely not Christian, but if he can read that and he can walk away and think, wow, that's that looks like it's that's exactly what that is. If he can
yeah,
see that, then and I think a couple things, probably from 9/11 was an inflection point. That was a change from where the nation was, and then the way the world was before that, and now the way the world's this way. And then the second one was in 2020, not with just the pandemic, but with just how brazen the Democrats pulled that off in 2020. So I feel like there's two big obvious things there. But yeah, I'm surprised at how obvious it is and how asleep the church is, at how
yeah,
a guy like Joe Rogan can get it. But then if you look at Ken Gentry or some other, Gary DeMar, some other famous preterists, be like, that doesn't mean anything. And
yeah,
it's shocking to me.
yeah. That they can't see it. To me, it's the bright red flashing light, and and they just don't want to see it. And I just, it's really kind of amazing, because you have, in many ways, guys like Rogan and uh, Carlson, all these different people are almost being prophetic more than the church is being prophetic, because they're saying we see this as being an inevitability. And the digital currency is an inevitability. It makes sense, not only from the problems economically around the world, but if you're going to bring people into a centralized, organized governmental system, it has to be based around a centralized economic system and basis of exchange. But
Yeah.
ultimately, the scariest thing about it is it yields ultimate control over the money markets to governments, and that's where it's the people don't realize that when you can't just take paper and buy whatever you want, whenever you want, however you want, and you have to go through a digital system that monitors and controls what you have and where it goes. They don't understand that that's going to be an incredible loss of freedom. And
Hmm.
most people, it's interesting, because today only one person in 25 has the equivalent of $1 bill in their pocket. Most Americans have no currency whatsoever. They do everything digitally. So we're already there. It's just a matter of the fact that them telling us we're going to make the conversion. I saw it happen in Russia twice, where they devalued their currency and saw people wiped out overnight. Just wake up one morning and their money was worth a tenth of what it was worth the night before. And so all of their future plans were, and it was just basically the government trying to balance its books. And so that's why there's so many dynamics. I mean, I could just go on and on and on, as you know, about just the different things that are happening. Because even when we had the bailout, in 2008 for all these irresponsible financial institutions who got saved by being bought out and bailed out. And now, but most people don't realize there's also a dynamic within financial law. It's called the bail-in, where when you put your money into the bank can actually, if it's in trouble, take your money to pay its bills and cover its debts, and you're just out. And there's so many of things like that where the powerful elites have already created a system that they're always protected, and we're just the suckers, who will get taken.
It's lateral damage.
Yep, that's what we are.
All right, let's move into the Q&A time here. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, there's a lot of questions. Okay, from Joan Hoskins, question: will Satan be in a different heaven than the church during the tribulation prior to him being kicked out? So I guess, are we going to see Satan in heaven?
I don't believe so. No, I don't believe so. In fact, it's interesting how, I mean, here again, I think the problem we have is when we're trying to imagine eternal things through a time-based dynamic. We live in time, space, and matter. And so it's the kind of thing that I believe, actually, that when somebody dies and they go to heaven, I've had people say to me, well, I don't want to leave my family and be separated from my loved ones. And I've shared with them, I believe that, the time-space continuum is only limited to the material world. And so when you're in heaven, you're going to find, before you have a chance to look around and see where you're at, you're going to see all your loved ones there with you. And so I think that's kind of an abstract concept, but it's a roundabout way to try to answer the question. But I don't believe that we're going to have to deal with that, with the evil one, because I think that when we're in eternity, we're going to be in a new dimension, a dynamic that's so different than anything we can even imagine. And I think this is where we get in a lot of troubles when we try to figure out how heaven works, because it has a whole different set of physics than the ones we know. It's the kind of thing where Jesus could simply walk into a room after his resurrection and be there, and the next moment he walks out of the room and he's not there. What is he doing? He's moving through dimensions of reality that we have no ability to even perceive. And so I know that in Revelation, it very clearly says in chapter 12 that Satan is cast down. When Jesus makes the statement about, I saw Satan fall, it's really grammatically, the sense is that immediately when demons were being cast out, Jesus was saying, I'm seeing the dominion of Satan being lost, that he's losing dominion. But I don't think he is eternally cast out until the middle of the tribulation, where he is no longer free to move. But we have to understand that he is a limited being, and I don't think that when we're in eternity that we will have any awareness in the sense of intrusion, if you will, of who he is. I think that the eternal dynamics of heaven and hell will be something that will be emblazoned in our mind. We'll see the darkness of it. But I think that part of the idea of being in heaven is not having to contemplate the torment of those who aren't. My opinion.
Yeah, very good. I don't. I just think all I know is, like, I think at the midpoint he is bound to the earth, like we're bound to the earth. Like
Right.
he's not able to, like you said, he's not free to move interdimensionally, at
Yeah.
whatever direction he wants. He's lost that freedom, and now he's kind of confined to the earth, just like we've been confined to the earth.
Yeah.
And that's why he says, "Woe to those, on the earth." Okay, Christina Reese, question: for peace and safety for Israel, could they possibly be offered neutrality among the nations to act as a hub of trade? No walls, no wars, neutral like Switzerland is neutral.
Well, yeah, I think that's a fascinating possibility. It's almost like Israel becomes a free trade zone. One of the things we have to keep in mind, though, that a lot of pieces on the board would have to be moved around, because Israel has a very intact and very dynamic economic situation. Their economy, even though it's suffered under these things, is a very vibrant economy. I mean, they have the highest number per capita of high-tech startups in the world. In Tel Aviv, you see these guys who live on the beach, and they call them high-tech millionaires, guys who invented something and sold it to Google or somebody else and Microsoft, they're a very intelligent, very creative, very dynamic economy. One of the things, though, I think is interesting is because when we talk about the end times, it's very clear from Revelation that Jerusalem is central to this world government. I think the Antichrist is going to rule out of that. So the kind of thing she's describing is something I think that in one sense is going to evolve into that London may no longer be the banking center of the world. It may be Jerusalem. And along with that, because that's really the key, that Amstel, the Rothschild basically said, I don't care who makes the laws. I just want to know who controls the money. And he says, if you control the money, you control everything. And so that essentially is when we talk about the evolution of one world currency, which implies one world economic system, you realize that that's going to become centralized in Jerusalem. And so what she's suggesting is interesting. Like I say, I think there's a lot of things that have to be moved around and changed and altered, but then somehow that's what happens ultimately.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think if it does happen, if Israel does gain that Switzerland-like status, because we know that the third temple will be built, but there'll also be portioned off for the Gentiles. I've always thought that the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque would be destroyed either by an errant missile that's launched from Iran or from whoever, Hezbollah, and it acts because a lot of those are just unguided missiles, and God could just tip it, touch it a little bit, and then just boom, lands on it, and they destroy their own temple. Or it could be at the earthquakes at the end of Gog and Magog. But I think at the end of that, I think that's where that if they do become a Switzerland, it would be after Gog Magog, and then I think it also would be requisite on the world moving into this new economic system, the digital system, where if the rapture collapses the United States, then the U.S. dollar collapses. That will have that ripple effect across the world, and that'll be the crisis that they will now be able to usher in the CBDCs that they've already tested out. Did the trial runs through a lot of the major banks around the world. So I don't know. It's interesting. Well, I guess we'll have to. I guess we'll know soon enough. I don't know.
Yeah, that's why
okay.
I refer to the Battle of Gog and Magog as the death of Islam, which I think is one of my points of view.
I agree with you on that 100%. Okay, Jackie Chris, thoughts on Dallas Willard?
I
might be able to answer this.
I hate to pick on anybody. I think that he has some valuable things to say, some incredible insights, but I think in the end of the day that oftentimes his teaching leads into a kind of a Christian legalism, and where you have a set of behaviors that basically you follow in order to produce a result. And one of the things that I try to point out to people is if you look at the scriptures, look at the Gospels, that there's one command that's repeated over 20 times in the Gospels, and that's when Jesus said, "Follow me." And so essentially, I think that when we think about living the Christian life, it's about being a follower of Jesus Christ. I read his word that I might understand his ways, his wants, his desires, his heart. But at the same time, it's not just a reading of the Bible and doing what the Bible said. It's also allowing the Holy Spirit to speak into my life and to follow his lead. Because I found most of my life, especially after I became more mature in my faith, has been able to learning how to hear God's voice in my life, and so that I know which way to go. It's like Isaiah said, it's like that voice coming up behind you and saying, "This is the way, walk ye in it." And I think that's there's a balancing act, because if I hear a voice telling me to do something and I see the Bible saying don't do that, then I know that voice isn't God's. But at the same time, it's kind of when I come down to when everybody in your community is closing their churches because the government says you're going to be a super spreader, and you hear this voice saying, "Don't." And that's a scary moment. And I couldn't say I could point to a chapter and verse. I mean, I could point to the Constitution, but I couldn't point to anything the Bible says, well, don't this, other than the fact that God says, don't forsake the assembling of yourselves together. But what about in a health emergency? And you go through all this conversation that we had during that time. So I think that, again, I think that Dallas Willard writes some pretty good stuff. I think he has some great insights, but I feel like, again, it comes out of a kind of a Augustinian concept of these are the rules, and this is how you live them. And I think that's what I found. I found myself feeling very guilty after reading some of this stuff. Like, oh, I'm not fasting enough. I'm not praying enough. I'm not doing enough. And I think that goes without saying. So I don't know. I think that disciplines are an important part of our life, but I think the disciplines that we develop in our pursuit of following God are very healthy. But when we live a life that's simply following disciplines, then I think that it becomes a dead faith.
Yeah, and I think this is, we see you and I and like-minded Christians, when we come across some teaching like that, or a teacher like that, that's teaching something that you can't put your finger on it. You don't know. I mean, it's
No.
not inherently wrong, but perhaps the overemphasis upon it, or if there's some facet about it that just doesn't sit right. If I go back and look at a guy like Dallas Willard, or Don Piper, or whoever, they have great things that they do teach, but then they obviously, their eschatology is out of whack, or it's askew. Then they're using that's what's filling that vacuum, instead of having the well-balanced perspective on all scripture together, where you tie in all the doctrines together. And I think that's a balanced Christian. When you take eschatology out of the equation, now you've got to fill that with something else.
Right.
And I think that's a big thing within Reformed theology. If you watch, there's a guy on YouTube, I can't remember his name, but he goes out and witnesses to Mormons all the time. He's a Reformed guy, brilliant guy, but he never uses eschatology in his evangelism as proof, fulfill prophecy, that kind of stuff, as proof of the veracity of Scripture. Rather, he goes to like a Greek philosophy, or he'll go to some other type of philosophical approach, or science approach, or he uses some other kind of rational thing. And I have just found that you cannot rationalize somebody into believing in the Lord.
Yeah.
You might rationalize them out of believing what they believe, because they can maybe see, okay, well, yeah, Mormonism is not just faith, it's like a blind faith. I mean, there is no archaeology in the Americas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you're not giving them anything. And that's why I guess I feel vexed when I listen to a lot of this teachers, not just preterism, but amillennial, postmillennial, all that diminish the power and the supernatural authority of Scripture. It just doesn't sit right with me.
I often wonder, I mean, how different are they from a Jordan Peterson? I mean, Jordan Peterson has some great stuff to say. It makes it a lot of sense. It's really, you're not going to get hurt by following his advice on most things, his 12 rules of life and all the rest of that stuff. But he's one of those guys who, Jesus knocked on the door. He thought about it for a while, and he decided he wasn't going to open it. I think that at the end of the day, I know that I came to faith not because somebody talked me into it, but I was compelled by the Holy Spirit. And I think ultimately, when you talk about people using an intellectual approach to evangelism, I'm not saying being anti-intellectual. You have to be able to give a reason for why you believe what you believe. But part of that reason is that I asked Jesus into my heart, and he came. And when he came, it altered my life forever. And I think that that's not something you can quantify. It's not something you put on a bookmarker and give to somebody.
Yeah, you get a bunch of those Agrippas. Yeah, you've almost convinced me. And unfortunately, that'll be the saddest people in hell that were that close to being saved, and they turned it down at the last second.
Yeah.
Okay. Next question, Sarah Rose, or it's Who Wants Rev 21? Search strength through joy, and you will see exactly what the Harris administration policy will be. Yep. Strength through joy is a communist. I think it's Maoist.
Yeah.
Or I don't know. It's communist or fascist, some form of fashion. Okay. This is my mom. She says, I was told by non-Christians that weren't obeying God's law by refusing to wear a mask and attending church. Who's right? I was told by non-Christians that we weren't obeying God's law by refusing to wear a mask and attending church. Who's right? I would say we are right. The Bible is right. God's right.
Well, I think everybody.
Um,
I think that even the science has proven that we were right. I mean, when
yeah,
it's all said and done, because we know the masks. We knew before and after the masking didn't help. Social distancing didn't make a difference, and there was such a thing as natural immunity. And I never told people whether they should get the jab or not. I just said I prayed about it and I sought God earnestly about it. And I heard God say to me before there was any science out there, he was very clear in telling me no. And I know people who got the jab and dropped dead within minutes after getting the jab. So, in terms of, the allowance of a vaccine that was untested, unproven, usually, in fact, you go when I remember when this all started, I went to John Hopkins website, medical school website, where they talked about vaccines, and they said vaccines take someplace between 7 to 10 years to prove their efficacy, and we're taking 7 to 10 days and giving people this jab, and there are a lot of people saying, well, I know of no harmful effects. And then there are tens of people who are, in fact, we have a conference coming up that we're hosting where we're allowing to use our facility of people who are vaccine injured. And there are just tons of people who have all sorts of autoimmune diseases. They have cancers, they have heart issues. What can I say? So, you know, those people will say what people will say, as Nancy Pelosi once said. But the simple fact is that those were efforts to guilt and persuade us into doing something that maybe in our conscience we didn't feel like we had permission or clarity to do. And I know, I know that we suffered even in our social media. I mean, I got capped on YouTube basically just because I said things like this, and I know this is the way it works. And it's always interesting to me why they were so rapidly overreacting to anybody that said anything about the vaccine
mhm,
negatively. Why did
yeah,
they? I mean, we were talking about a friend Pablo. He gets kicked off. Somebody said something, and he's off the air. YouTube cuts him. It's really kind of fascinating. You see that it's like the old saying: when you throw a rock at a pack of dogs and you hear a yelp, you know you hit one. So the simple fact is, there was a lot of yelping going on. So I don't know.
yeah. I had to explain to my job why I wasn't going to take it, and they said, "Well, you're prior military," and I have probably 3 or 4 pages worth of shot records, of everything
Yeah,
from anthrax to, I mean, everything. I've
yeah,
basically been getting everything, but I got out right before all this craziness in 2020 happened. And I said, "Well, look, a lot of those vaccines have been tested over decades," and I said, "They've been around forever." And I said, "This thing is just brand new." And I said, "This hasn't had time." And I said, "Even if I leave this job, this stuff's still going to be in my body, so I'm not taking it." And I caught it. My wife and I both caught it, but we ended up taking the Ivor path.
ivermectin. Yeah,
Yeah, and it worked, man. The same day, I started feeling better the same day. So
I had
all the
COVID. I had COVID twice, and it wasn't fun, but I survived. I mean,
and you got natural immunity now
I got
building
natural.
up. Okay. Torres, I'm a bit confused. So the appointed time is not really the appointed time, but depends on our response. I guess he was talking about your
Mhm.
predestination versus what was the other you made the point that it's not so much predestination as it is
We're predestined, but not predetermined.
predetermined. There you go.
Predetermined,
Yeah.
but not predestined. Yeah, yeah. Well, when you talk about the appointed time, again, you're from God's perspective. God knows the appointed time. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the problem. Is that I think the problem is that we need to understand that we view reality, we view all things through the lens of time. We don't view it through the lens of eternity. God uses the lens of eternity. So when God says He knows exactly the day and the hour, but I don't, And I think that's why he said, "Occupy till I come." Be engaged, which literally means to be engaged in doing what I've called you to do until the hour I come, because I don't know when that hour is coming. So there is an hour, it is an appointed time, but I don't think it's contradictory to say, but I don't know what that time is. And so, and that I believe that the reason why we're called to pray and to seek his face, and why God says, if you do this, then I will do that, over and over again, we have that if then dynamic, is because my praying does matter. It does make a difference. It does affect the things that are going on in the world. So, yet God, from His eternal perspective, knows the exact day and the exact hour.
Yeah. Same thing with Jonah and Nineveh, right? You
Mhm.
know, if the Ninevites had not repented, God would have destroyed them, you know,
Yeah,
but they did. And so God honored that, and I think they survived another 100 years or so. We may
yeah,
be seeing a whole generation worth of Ninevites in heaven, somewhere down the road
yeah.
that did repent and
Well,
somehow,
if
God
God is
saved them.
if God is long suffering that all should be saved, long suffering has to mean something. That God is
Yeah.
enduring certain stuff. He's putting up with stuff, um, and all for one basic objective, and that's that people would get saved. So I don't know. It's this is where I really struggle with people who believe in predestination, because I find that it removes any kind of evangelistic passion. It even removes a lot of love from people, because I look at, for example, that people, as I tell people I'm trans, I'm transphobic, but I just, but my whole point is, my heart breaks for people who buy into that, because I know that their life is a greater torment than anything I can even imagine. At the same time, I can't say it's not. I can't say it's right. I can't say it's okay. I have to say it is wrong. You have to call it out. But I call it out not because I want to be right and to prove them wrong. I call it out because I hope that they will repent and turn.
Yeah. Yeah. It breaks my heart too, because I look at that the guy that I was telling you about, the soldier, who was married, had kids, and he chose to go this way, and now he's not just impacting his life, but his parents, his spouse, his children. I mean, you can there's I've listened to so many of these horror stories of people that try to detransition back to whatever their normal gender was, and it's just a horrific journey for them, even to try and get back to any sense of normalcy, and most of the time, it's the damage is so profound that they're never gonna be the same.
No,
There's never gonna be any, I don't wanna say normal life going forward from there, but yeah, it's heartbreaking, and there's so many things that are heartbreaking these days. It's not just that. I mean, gosh, uh, I think that's part of our being vexed in this time is just seeing the amount of wickedness and the fruits of wickedness and all the destruction that is the across the landscape from this
yeah,
satanic and demonic influence that's been running wild here. Okay, 65 GTO trips. I do wonder if Satan has deceived believers and the Americans at large to think 60 to 85% of the country is radical, trans, LGBTQ, whatever, not normal. I mean, it's really only 5% controlling 95%. I do wonder if Satan has deceived believers and the Americans at large, 60 to 85% of the country. I'm not entirely sure. It is a small, tiny percentage of the population that is demanding everybody upend, thousands of years of gender identity, cultural norms, marriage norms, etc. So I'm not as sure if that's the question or not. Brendan Navy question: with all this evil, is the government allowed to have drones hovering over the house? One about the size of 1,000 feet radius every night hovers. Maybe some kind of UFO or something. Um, I'm not sure how to answer that question. With all this evil, is the government allowed to have? Well, here's a theory that I have, and it's purely a theory. In 1947, when we had Roswell, the U.S. government did collect biologicals. They were able to take those things. I think they're demons or some kind of the demonic host or whatever. I don't think they're fallen angels necessarily, because I think fallen angels are still angels, are still able to manifest physically when they want to, right? They're not bodiless spirits like the demons. I believe demons are the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim that were killed before the flood, etc. That's why they're always looking to possess things, whereas fallen angels, just like holy angels, can manifest physically whenever they want into whatever body that they manifest into. Where Hebrews says that we've entertained angels unaware at times, I think they still can retain that ability. But what we've discovered, though, is that if these demonic hosts working with people can manufacture clones, which we would call these little gray aliens or whatever, those demons can possess those things and can embody those things. Well, whatever happened at 1947, we took those, and at some point we began to collaborate with these things.
Yeah.
And now, just think about Operation Paperclip. I mean, we took 1,600 Nazi scientists, from Germany, who had done all manner of evil things, and brought them into and build our space program. So it's not outside of the realm of possibility that we do this. But I think that we've been working with them, the government at certain echelons, DARPA, CIA, whoever, have been tapping into that technology and those abilities, so that we come up later with things like Operation Stargate, or these mind where they're remote viewing and all these things that we're being taught how to do from these entities. And I'm not saying that's the Republicans or Democrats. I'm saying that these are deep state echelons that we probably don't even know exist. But I think they're probably working with them to create the UFO stuff that we see flying around. I don't know if there's a drone 1,000 feet high or 1,000 feet big. To me, that's something beyond the normal government. That's shadow government or something else, But theory.
It kind
Mark,
of defies the idea of a drone.
Marcia Natcall, question: how do you respond to someone who doesn't understand wokeism or never heard of it? Um, I just tell them it's part of this cultural Marxism. I'm sure they've heard of Marxism, and Marxism begins to create a new spectrum of language within a language, that now you categorize words, that words equal violence, and all these other kind of things. Like today, the kids have a whole new language, and I'm just learning it. So you got bruh, so everything is bruh, and then they're like, what the sigma? So sigma is now the
Yeah.
cap in, riz. I mean, like there's just a whole new dialect now, but it's kind of like wokeism now is like this whole new dialect within culture that is intersectional. You've categorized people. Now words are violence. I mean, it's just this whole laundry list of
Yeah. Well,
I
it's
don't know.
it's it's almost like it's intentionally defying definition, because each person can redefine the terms based upon their perception of that term. It's hard to explain something that is based upon confusion and make sense out of it. But essentially, it's the idea that your eyes become open to their point of view, so
Mm.
that whatever they say is reality, suddenly you have to accept it as being equally valid, even though they have no basis or proof for it. I remember I just came up again, so watching a video of a young gal who was suing her parents because she didn't give them permission for her to be born. And I was watching this explanation, and it was just, I mean, I think she was actually very serious, but she was basically saying, they never asked me if I wanted to be born. They just brought me into this world. She's going through this whole explanation of her position. And I thought, um, I'm expecting somebody in white coats to come and carry her away. And yet that is viewed as being equally valid today, because when you talk about Charlie Kirk's statement before, that if there is basically every God is equal, and then there is no morality. Well, the reality is that if there's various kinds of morality, all you have is amorality, which ultimately leads to immorality. And it's kind of like this idea of this freedom. I'm free to do whatever I want. It's kind of like the freedom you have if you open the door in the airplane and you jump out. You are free to fall, but ultimately there's going to be a collision with reality when you hit the earth. And I think that that's the sad thing, to watch a culture going headlong into that kind of a suicidal self-destruction, that we're plunging off the cliff, hoping that the ground beneath us isn't solid.
Okay. Question. Corey Miller asked question: at the midpoint of the tribulation, who kills the 2/3 of the Jewish people that don't flee quickly? We were only told the Antichrist, but it is to be worse than the Holocaust. How can he do it?
How can they? Give them all the COVID vaccine? It's the idea of mass extinctions of people or groups of people. Genocide is something that we have become increasingly effective at, and it's happening around the world right now. I mean, there are all sorts of people who are being targeted by other people. So I don't think it's a question of the technology necessary to do it. It's just the willpower and the application of the resources in order to accomplish it. So many times I think it's just we underestimate. It's kind of like, I read a book years ago called The Bloodlands, about the 16 million people who perished between the Soviets and the Nazis in Ukraine before and after World War II. And I love what the author said. He said, if you try to think about 16 million people, how they could kill 16 million people, your mind you can't get your mind around it. But he said you have to think about it as one person at a time, 16 million times over. And that's really, suddenly within a 20-year period, they were able to eliminate 16 million people in a less technologically advanced era that we are in. So Hitler himself is responsible for 20 million. Stalin's responsible probably for 30 to 40 million people. Mao was responsible to 60 million people. How do you do that? There are a number of ways that you can do it, and it's just a matter of applying the technology to where people are.
Yeah, I would say too that if you've seen that movie Murderbots, it came out I think in 2016, 2017. It has I mean, rudimentary by today's standards, but they have these drones that can swarm. So they're tiny drones. They're not very big, but they swarm together, and then they have enough charge, explosive charge, that they can hit somebody in the forehead. They target in the forehead, and that's like being shot in the head. And these things, they can mass produce these by the thousands, tens of thousands. They get all programmed together, and then you can swarm them like a swarm of bees. So I think I think the getting to that point by the midpoint of the tribulation is not going to be very challenging for him to be able to wipe out is whoever his enemies are, whoever he wants to destroy at that point. But um, yeah, they did it in the past. They can definitely do it. And one of the things too, if you look at the seal judgments, if we're to take it at its word, a quarter of the world's population will be dead within a very short period of time.
Yeah.
Now, if you've looked over the last 6,000 years of recorded human history and all the battles that have ever been fought that we know of, and some of this is speculative, especially when you go back to the battles in antiquity, but you're looking at maybe 500 million people have died in wars, most of that coming here in the latter part of the 20th century. Uh, Now you're talking about 2 billion people being killed in just a few years. The carnage is going to be unbelievable. It's going to be beyond anything we can. I've landed. I was told this last time. I was in medevac pilot in Iraq, and for the last 20 years, and then I deployed to Iraq back in 2005 and six. Well, early 2006, we were deployed to a Moscow site, and we landed in this soccer stadium where these suicide bombers had detonated their vest and stuff. And I mean, the bodies laying around, it was surreal. Like you're looking at it. I'm looking at it through the screen of my helicopter. I'm right in the middle of all of it, and your mind is trying to process it. It's having a hard time to do that because you're thinking movie, but it's not. It's real life. And I think that's the way it's going to be in that very short period of time. 2 billion people will be dead, and it's hard for us to comprehend that level of carnage. But I mean, the technology is there. I mean, we had this technology. We've had it for years now, and I'm not even talking about intercontinental ballistic missiles or anything. I'm talking about like things that shoot people or kill people up close. All right. Where are we at? Pookie question: during the great white throne judgment, when we see Lucifer bend his knee to Yeshua, what will be our thoughts and his beauty, and will any of us say with him, like, why? We know why. Pride. I don't know. Do you think we'll watch the great white throne judgment? Like we'll be witness
Um,
to it?
yeah, I actually think we'll be there, but I don't think we'll view it through this lens. I mean, there seems to be a great deal of rejoicing in heaven, according to Revelation 21, over this. This is finally ended. So it's like I think the rejoicing at the end of World War II that went around the world because this plague of the Axis had been brought to an end, is kind of like a glimpse of the kind of celebratory desire that rests inside the hearts of every one of us, because we want to see evil brought to an end. And I think I think that God's going to let us rejoice and celebrate that victory. And I don't think that we'll be shedding tears or feeling sorry for anybody. Um,
Yeah.
but I think we will see it. Um, I think that's why John told us about it.
Okay. 65 GTO trips. Why take the entire book of Revelation literally in context, but then allegorize Babylon? Americans have a skewed view. Israel itself is as bad as America in terms of the alphabet mafia. Amsterdam and others bad too. I just will say that I don't. I take the golden rule of interpretation when I look at the entirety of the Bible. I just take it literally, unless taking it literally makes it nonsensical, and then I just apply the normal rules of grammar to it. And then if I see in Revelation the word like, something was like this or was as this, and that's what we know as a simile. It's describing something. It's not saying that saying something is like the mouth of a lion is not saying that it is exactly the mouth of a lion. It's saying it's something like the mouth of a lion. He's using that imagery that we get from Daniel chapter 7 and 8 to convey that these are nations, or this is some form of government structure, because that's what it was in Daniel. So we're not making up our own interpretation. We're letting the Bible interpret the Bible. Um, but then you get to a passage like in Revelation 20, where it talks about 1,000 years. It gives you no simile, gives you no metaphors. It just says 1,000 years. So I take that literally because normal reading of grammar forces me to take that position. And if I deviate from taking a literal interpretation, then I'm the one that's corrupting the interpretation, not what the Bible says. It doesn't give me that leeway. If you get to something that says it's like a mouth of a lion or like the feet of a bear, well, there's a little bit of wiggle room in there, because it's describing, he's using the symbolism to describe something that represents something else. So, but we know that symbolism is not arbitrary. It comes from other parts of the Bible that we get. So as far as Babylon goes, I know there's uh, mixed views on who Babylon is. I've got some friends in the pre-trib community that believe it's the United States. I've got some other friends that don't, and I don't know where I fall in that. I guess I'm on the fence on identifying. I know we'll know. I mean, the second after the rapture, we'll know who all that is. At that point, so won't be a mystery at that point. But this side of the rapture, we're still, I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think you're right. I just think that when you talk about Mystery Babylon, it says basically she rides upon a beast. It gives us a very clear indication, revelation, who the beast is. You're talking about Daniel, Revelation, you compare him, the seven heads, the 10 horns. I mean, all of these things are seven mountains, seven horns, heads and horns. all of these are interpreted within the text itself. So it's not like John is just throwing out some images and we're supposed to figure it out on our own or give our own private interpretation. It's giving us an interpretive grid right within the text itself. And so I don't think that it's a stretch in terms of saying who is Babylon. Well, that's a question, because obviously Babylon is a reference to a spiritual dimension or religious system, and because that's how it's referred to, as the spirit of Babylon, all the way through. So I don't know. I don't think it's that hard. I just think it takes some serious study. But I think that could I apply it? I think that I see a Babylon-like spirit in America. Does that make us the Great Babylon? I don't think so. It's almost, we
Yeah.
talk about people having a Jezebel spirit or different things like that. We're really trying to find a way of verbalizing a dynamic that we see as wicked. And that's really what Babylon becomes, is a descriptive of spiritual whoredoms, if you will.
Yeah, I think whatever this final world system is after the rapture, if my thoughts on this are correct, if the rapture is what triggers the collapse of the United States, and let's say it's 10% of the American population, that's 30, what, 2 million, 34 million people instantly gone like that. The difference between the US and China, where China probably has more Christians than we do, is that our Christians are spread throughout the entirety of the social strata, doctors, lawyers, cops,
Mhm.
every profession, and so on. That would rip a hole through the entire economic world, world for the United States. Whereas in China, most of the Christians are going to be on the lower echelons who aren't running things. Um, they're not going to be allowed to hold any positions of power or anything like that because they don't toe the line with the worshiping the Communist Party. So I just think that when we collapse, that will requisite the that will be the necessary crisis for the world to reorganize itself like it's always wanted to for the last 70, 80 years. But now the United States is no longer in the way, and now they're able to do the Club of Rome thing or whatever it is, however they decide to organize itself. But then that system does have that spirit of Babylon. It does have that same Babylon mentality. Um, and in the same vein as the Roman Empire at its height as an imperial power, we maybe become some type of imperial regional powers, 10 regions or whatever it ends up being. Point is that you're right; it's got that spirit of Babylon in it, and that's diametrically opposed to the spirit of God, and that's where this battle is going to be waged through, going to the end of the Revelation toward Armageddon itself.
One of the things, Pete, I think too is important for us is that a lot of times when we're talking about these events and relating them to the current time we're in, we always have to be, I think, cautious. Say, in my opinion, or here's a conjecture. This is how it could work out. But until it happens, we're not going to know exactly. Like, it's like talking about the mark of the beast. What exactly is the mark of the beast going to look like? Well, the technology is already there. I mean, there's so many options for it. But what will exactly be? I just know that it's going to mean that a person has decided to pledge allegiance to the Antichrist and to Satan, and in the same way that we are born again, they're going to be condemned again. But there again, like, so I think that sometimes we get hard, people get hard and fast. And I think part of the problem we have to face too is in the churches. I think that prophecy predictions has become kind of an industry all to itself. And it's the goal isn't to get
Understatement.
people to buy my book. The goal is to get people to look up and know that their redemption is drawing near, and to live like today is the last day you're going to be here on earth. So anyway, those are my 2 cents. That's my conjecture.
Yeah, yeah. I try to preface a lot of this, and when I teach through Revelation, I always say, look, there's going to be parts of this I don't even know. Like I don't even know how to explain demonic locusts coming out of the abyss. I can give you some peripheral information, like locusts don't have a king according to Proverbs, 27, etc. There are things that we can talk about, but what they actually look like, what they do, and other than what the Bible tells us, we just aren't going to know. And then if anybody tells you what they are, they're probably lying. I just or they I just preface most of that with, hey, I don't know. This is a theory. This is an idea. It's conjecture, speculation, whatever. And I think none of us are really going to know until it happens. That's this whole idea of, I believe in progressive revelation and progressive illumination. Revelation being that throughout the course of human history, God has spoke through men at different times, different places to create the Bible that we have. So it's those "Thus saith the Lord" kind of moments, and then he quit speaking in 95 AD with the revelation of Jesus Christ that he gave to John to record. And then after that, it's been everything since then has been progressive illumination. As things begin to happen, it begins to make sense. Oh, I get it now. The two witnesses lying in the streets of Jerusalem and the whole world sees their bodies. That didn't make sense to any generation prior to the ones that didn't have satellite television or smart devices. And now I can live stream a street camera in Moscow if I want to, or whatever town that has that program. You can watch whatever you want from anywhere in the world. And I'm sure there are people here in the chat, out of the almost 650 people that are from different parts of the world, and they're watching what's going on here. I'm in Texas, you're in Washington, and we have that level of technology these days to do that. It makes sense to us, but it didn't make sense to people before that technology came about, and they had no way of even reconciling how that could be possible before satellites came about, satellite television. It would be like going back to the 1850s and explaining a smartphone to somebody. Like that just doesn't make it. There's no way to correlate that to them. So there are things in Revelation that are going to happen that we have no idea how they're going to happen. We just know what the Bible says. We know other parts of the Bible that may shed some light, some insight to that, but beyond that, it's largely speculation on if we go beyond what the text says. So, okay, question for Ken: do you think the Nephilim seed carry on through the Great Tribulation? It's from Pookie.
I have no idea. I mean,
Come on, you have the answer.
we could spend days just talking about Nephilim. I mean, how do you explain the locusts? I mean, we have a lot of different ideas of what the locusts that come out of the bottomless pit are, and different opinions, but we're not giving any kind of specific definition. In the same way with the Nephilim, it's a peculiar thing, but it's one of those dynamics that I know there are people who hold strong opinions on if you have six fingers, you're an heir of the Nephilim and so forth. I don't know. Can I plead above my pay grade? I defer to people who might be smarter than I am, because I actually have no idea how that's going to play out.
Yeah, I don't either. Our friend Lee Brainerd, if you're curious, he just did a video on that. Pookie, I mean, unless you may already know or have already watched it, but he did the black thread, the seed war, I guess, from Genesis 3 between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. So I think I know they existed in the past. I'm pretty sure they exist today, not as giants, but as those traits are refined down into whatever. And I'm sure they will carry on through the tribulation, because that will be the really Satan's chance. He's get the last chance to like get this world that he wants. Okay, here's the last question from Annette. Question: if the church doesn't stand against the babies being murdered and children being mutilated, do you think God will give us a Trump victory or return our nation to God's law? So I kind of think that if we don't get Trump, then we get Harris. And I don't see Trump as necessarily being, I want to say, not a good thing. So this is kind of touchy here. I think that there's still some danger for the pre-trib community if a Trump victory happens, because most of the post-trib, preterist, dominionist, all those people hate us. And if they get into the positions of authority, voices speaking to, whispering into his ear, Trump, I mean, I don't think things necessarily go that great for us. I don't know. I know that there's persecution, but it may just be persecution against particular groups within the church, not the church writ large under like that type of administration. If it's a Harris administration, then it's just Christians all lumped together. We're all going to be suffering together. But I think either way, God's timing for this is going to happen regardless of who's in the office. Whether the rapture, let's just say hypothetically it was in 2026, then it's going to happen regardless who's in power. How much freedom we have between now and 2026 would then largely depend on how the American people vote on that. So, your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I mean, for me, I have no trouble going on record saying I'm going to vote for Trump because the alternative is unacceptable. I
Yeah.
know friends who I talked to a friend recently who said that he wasn't going to vote at all, and because he didn't feel like it made any difference. I don't hold that view, but I understand the feeling. But I think at the same time we have to understand that the church has always been most effective not when things are going the way we want it to go, but rather when we've been going upstream and fighting the current of culture. It's where we can, the greater the darkness, the more clearly we shine. And when sin does abound, grace does more abound. So I mean, I'm the last one to say I want see this country demised. I love this country. I love the opportunities it's provided, that we can do things like this and we don't have to hide in a basement so that people don't know what's going on. At the same time, you have to understand that the church, when we look at the example of Nazi Germany, I think it is a prototype of what we see totalitarianism does. That what happened was that the most of the church was compliant. Most of them recently, it was kind of a shocking example where they found they were repairing the bell in a church that had been there for about 100 years, and they found that the bell had been had a Nazi insignia on it, had been donated by the Hitler government to the church. And they did all sorts of things, gave them money, give them, if they just simply would say that Adolf Hitler was the Messiah. And most of the churches were willing to comply with that and go along with that narrative. And I think that we're going to see something very similar in our own country, particularly if there's a Harris administration, because it's not like they're pretending what they're not. They're trying to hide their game plan. They're being very open and vocal, and we are not favored within their administrative guidelines. So I think if Harris comes to power, I think we're going to just see an increasing pressure. We may not see an overnight cascade of persecution, but I think we're just going to find that the noose is going to start tightening, and there's being more and more restrictions. Churches will come under more scrutiny. People like you and I will be kicked off the airways. It'll just happen in incremental ways, but it will happen with such a steadiness. Because one of the things I find about those who are in power, that they tend to be ruthless and they tend to be relentless, and they may not do it overnight, but they'll just simply do it in the dark. And it's happening around us anyway. Most people don't realize how much our world has changed in just the last 10 years because it's just so incremental. We are the frogs in the kettle who are being slowly cooked to death by the culture. And it's kind of the crazy thing. I think it was the saying that was years ago, what was it? That when things become, when the unthinkable becomes debatable, it'll soon become acceptable. And I think that that's where we're at today, that there are things that 10 years ago weren't even, you realize it was in the 1990s, they passed the federal law that said marriage was between a man and a woman, and Bill Clinton signed it into law. I mean, that was the law of the United States. And suddenly that's thrown out the window because the Supreme Court said it's not fair and equal. And so suddenly the definition of marriage and the family and everything was changed overnight. And most of the country in the world just went along with that. And now look where we're at now, where we're actually, as somebody once put it, if we can believe that a man can become a woman, we'll believe anything. And that's really what all of this is about. It's getting us to accept anything they say as being valid. It has nothing to do with sex. It has nothing to do with transsexuality. The transsexual percentage of the population is probably a fraction of a percentage of people. And yet it's not about that. It's about getting the boundaries pushed away. So we remove all restrictions, all morality, and it becomes the rule of whatever we say. So when we talk about the dark state, the deep state or whatever it is, the swamp, however you want to brand it, there is an evil cabal that is seeking to move the agenda forward, and that is seeking towards to establish elite rule over the world. And we happen to be in that most present time in world history where we're actually able to see it coming to pass.
Amen. Well, that's all the questions. Ken, you've been a trooper. You've been here with me now for almost 2.5 hours. I don't know if you're used to these long form. I normally do 2 to 3 hours. So I you hung with me the whole time. I greatly appreciate it. And the Lord's blessed us with good technology. So hey, I just want to say thank you. You've been a huge influence on my life and on my ministry. I've always looked forward to listening to your sermons, your lessons, going to your website. I find you've just got a finger on the pulse of things, unlike most other, really anybody else I can think of. Maybe just a handful of you in the United States that are way ahead of your time and seeing what's coming down the pike. But I thank you for your time. My audience thanks you. Love to have you back sometime in the near future, maybe 6 months, maybe after the election, whatever happens with that.
That would
We'll
be a
see.
conversation. Yeah.
But
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. I enjoy it.
yeah. All right, and I'll get with you. Let me end the live stream and then just hang about for 1 second, and then we'll figure out how to get this stuff to you. Thank you,
Okay.
guys. Appreciate your time today. Appreciate the questions, and thank you, moderators, for keeping the peace in the chat, collecting the questions for me, and basically helping everything else run smoothly. I will be on possibly Friday, but if not Friday, then Monday, and then got some roundtables coming up in September, or I'm sorry, it'll be for October on paganism, the occult, and some other things with L.A. Marzulli, Mondo Gonzalez, and Lee Brainerd. So that should be an interesting conversation. And until then, we'll see you later, and God bless you.